You're arresting the picture you already carry in your head. You haven't looked at the man standing inside it. Those were the words Mason Callahan spoke at 5:12 in the morning, standing barefoot on his porch with his hands behind his back and 4 patrol vehicles flooding his property with light. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just looked Sheriff Owen Kincaid directly in the eye and said what every person watching from behind a curtain in Red Mesa was too afraid to think. Inside that house, his daughter was trying to keep breathing. And outside it, a town was already writing his verdict. If this story hits you deep, subscribe to this channel and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this ride has traveled. The call came in at 3:47 in the morning, and by the time Sheriff Owen Kincaid had his boots on and his badge clipped, the story was already half written in his mind. The Red Mesa Community Clinic had been robbed, not vandalized, not broken into, by some desperate kid looking for pills robbed clean and deliberately, the way professionals do it. Sealed cases of emergency medication, the kind of inventory that kept cardiac patients alive through brutal Arizona summers, had been loaded and removed in under 11 minutes. The security camera, mounted above the rear loading dock, had captured exactly what it was meant to capture: a broad-shouldered man in a black leather vest, the back panel stitched with something the grainy footage made hard to read, walking without hurry toward a dark motorcycle and riding west into the desert dark. And then at 4:23 in the morning, someone called the tip line. Anonymous female voice, possibly disguised. The cases, the caller said, were hidden inside a garage on the western edge of town. Mason Callahan's garage. Kincaid knew the name. Every person in Red Mesa knew the name, though most of them knew it the way you know a name printed on a sign you've always driven past without stopping. Mason Callahan ran an independent repair shop out of a converted structure behind his property. He worked alone. He kept odd hours. And he wore on the back of his leather vest every single day a patch that made certain people in Red Mesa cross to the other side of the street before they'd ever said a word to him. Hell's Angels. Kincaid had 4 patrol vehicles on Mason's property before the sun had any intention of rising. He did not call ahead. He did not knock once and wait. He pulled up in formation, lights cutting across the property in wide sweeping arcs, and he stood at the edge of the gravel with a warrant in his hand and a posture that had already decided what a kind of morning this was going to be. The door to the main house opened before Kincaid reached the porch steps. Mason Callahan stepped out, and the first thing everyone noticed, was that he didn't look panicked. He didn't look guilty. He looked like a man who had been woken from shallow sleep by a sound he recognized as trouble, and who had chosen, very deliberately, not to run from it. He was barefoot. His faded blonde hair was tied back loosely, a few strands across his jaw. He wore a white t-shirt and jeans, and the leather vest was already on because Mason Callahan wore that vest the way some men wore their faith close to the body, through every kind of weather. The Hell's Angels patch on the back caught the patrol lights and held them. Deputy Carl Musset put his hand on his holster before Mason had cleared the second porch step. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Kincaid said. Mason raised both hands, palms out, and kept walking slowly until he was standing in front of the sheriff at the bottom of the steps. He looked at the warrant. He looked at the 4 vehicles. He looked at the deputies, arranged in the kind of positioning you use when you expect resistance. And then he looked back at Kincaid. "You want to search my garage," Mason said. It wasn't a question. "We have a warrant to search the premises." "Then search it." Mason's voice was quiet and even, not defeated, contained, like a man who had spent a long time deciding how he wanted to conduct himself in the moments when other people lost their composure. "I'm going to ask you one thing before you go in. You're not in a position to make requests. I'm asking you to let me go inside for 60 seconds. My daughter is in there. She had a heart episode 2 days ago, and she's on a medication schedule. I need to write it down for my neighbor before." "Your daughter can call her own neighbor," Kincaid said. He gestured to Musset. "Cuff him. She's 22 years old, and she doesn't know the dosage schedule because I handle it," Mason said, and his voice didn't rise, but it landed with a weight that made two of the younger deputies glance sideways at each other. 60 seconds. One piece of paper. That's what I'm asking. You're asking for time. I'm not giving it. Musset put the cuffs on. Mason let him. He didn't pull away, didn't tense, didn't say anything as the metal clicked around his wrists. He just turned his head and looked back at the front door of his house. And, standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, one hand braced against the doorframe, her face pale and her dark eyes wide, was Lena Callahan. She was trying not to look scared. She wasn't quite managing it. The blue notebook on the kitchen counter, Mason called to her. His voice was steady as level ground. Everything's in the blue notebook. Call Mrs. Yardley across the road. She knows what to do. Lena pressed her lips together and nodded once. Mason let Kincaid walk him to the patrol vehicle, and just before Musset put a hand on his head to guide him into the back seat, Mason turned and looked at the sheriff one more time. You're arresting the picture you already carry in your head, he said. You haven't looked at the man standing inside it. Kincaid didn't answer. He closed the door. Inside the garage, the search took 9 minutes. Deputies found the 2 stolen clinic cases under a canvas drop cloth near the rear workbench. Sealed. Intact. Exactly where the anonymous tip had said they'd be. Kincaid stood over them and felt the specific satisfaction of a man whose instincts have been confirmed. He looked at the Hells Angels patched through the squad car window and thought, there it is. There's your proof. Deputy Rachel Monroe was the one who logged the evidence. She was 31, 5 years on the force, and she had a habit that her supervisor had gently tried to break her. She wrote everything down, including things that didn't seem to matter yet. She had 3 notebooks worth of observations that had never made it into an official report because they concerned things that turned out to be nothing. Most of them had turned out to be nothing. She opened the nearest case and checked the seal. Intact. She photographed it from 4 angles. Then she stood up and looked at the rear door of the garage, and something shifted slightly in the organized structure of what she thought she was looking at. The lock on the rear door was a heavy-duty deadbolt. It was not broken. It was not scratched in the way that brute force tampering left scratches. The mechanism had been disengaged cleanly, the kind of clean that you got from an electronic bypass tool, the kind that cost more money than most people in Red Mesa had ever spent on anything that fit in a pocket. She wrote that down. Then she looked at the garage's security camera. The small red light that indicated active recording was dark. She checked the unit. It was powered and functional. But the recording had stopped. She pulled the timestamp log from the unit's memory card. The camera had stopped recording at 4:06 in the morning. It had restarted at 4:23. 17 minutes. The anonymous tip had been called in at 4:23. Rachel stood there for a moment in the desert heat that was already building even before sunrise, and she wrote that down too. She did not say anything to Kincaid, not because she was afraid of him, though there was truth in the fact that he didn't receive questions about his warrants the way he received other things, but because she didn't have anything yet. She had 3 observations that together formed a shape she couldn't name. A clean lock, a gap in the recording, cases that sat under canvas in a garage without a trace of the fine red desert dust that settled on every horizontal surface in this county within a matter of hours. The cases were clean, not wiped clean, not surface cleaned. Clean in the way that something is clean when it has never been in this environment long enough to collect what the environment leaves on everything. She wrote that down too. And she closed her notebook and followed the other deputies back to their vehicles and watched Mason Callahan's squad car pull out of the gravel drive in the gray pre-dawn light while Lena stood in the doorway and watched her father leave. By 7 in the morning, Red Mesa had already made its decision. The feed at the local diner was going. People who had never exchanged a word with Mason Callahan were exchanging words about him with great authority and feeling. The name came paired with the patch always. The patch as though the 2 things were a single unit of meaning that explained itself without investigation. The Hells Angels, a theft, a camera that stopped recording. Well, what did you expect? Patsy Gorman, who ran the feed store on Meridian, told 3 people before she'd finished her first cup of coffee that she'd always known there was something off about that garage. She didn't specify what she'd known or when she'd known it, because the knowing was the kind that arrived fully formed the moment it was needed. Harold Birch, who had worked at the county assessor's office for 19 years, mentioned that bikers as a category had always been trouble. Someone at his table agreed. Someone else agreed louder. Nobody mentioned not at Patsy's table, or Harold's, or any of the 6 other tables where the story was circulating through the morning that Mason Callahan had repaired Patsy's delivery truck twice without charging her labor because she'd been going through a hard patch after her husband's surgery. Nobody mentioned that Mason had loaded his truck with water and driven routes through last summer's worst heat advisory, leaving cases at the properties of elderly residents who couldn't drive to the distribution point. Nobody mentioned that he had, on 4 separate occasions that anyone could have counted if they'd been counting, stopped on the highway to help stranded motorists who turned out to be tourists with rental cars and no idea where they were. None of that was the story this morning. The story this morning was the patch and the cases and what everyone had always suspected. Kincaid stood in the booking room at the sheriff's department and watched Mason Callahan answer the processing questions with the same measured patience he'd shown in his driveway, and he felt that satisfaction harden into something more certain. The man wasn't shaken. That was almost confirmation by itself. In Kincaid's experience, guilty men either fell apart or they performed a calm that had too many edges showing. But Mason Callahan's calm had no edges. It was the real thing, and Kincaid interpreted it as the composure of a man who had been in rooms like this before. "You want to tell me what those cases were doing in your garage?" Kincaid asked. "I want to tell you they weren't in my garage until someone put them there," Mason said. "Someone put them there." "That's right. Underneath your canvas drop cloth, on your workbench, in your garage that you lock every night." "That's right." Kincaid set a folder on the table between them. Inside were 3 photographs, the security camera still of the robbery, printed as clear as the equipment allowed, the broad shoulders, the leather vest, the motorcycle. "That's not you," Mason said, looking at it without touching it. "The vest is the same. The vest is a Hell's Angels vest." There are approximately, Mason paused, counting something internal, 450 people in Arizona alone who wear a version of what's in that picture. The anonymous tip named you specifically. "Anonymous tips are free," Mason said. "They don't cost the person making them anything. That's what makes them useful if you want to frame somebody." Kincaid leaned back. "Here's my problem with that theory. If someone wanted to frame you, they'd have had to know your garage layout, know your camera, know your lock, know your schedule, well enough to know you'd be away from the property during the window they needed." Mason looked at him steadily. "That's not a problem with my theory. That's a description of someone who planned this carefully." Kincaid closed the folder. "Or someone who knows his own garage layout, his own camera, his own lock." Mason said nothing for a moment. Then, "I was 78 miles from here last night. The chapter runs a mercy run every year, water, medical supplies, generators. We've been doing it for 16 years. Last night, there were 71 riders. Every one of them can place me on that route. Alibi witnesses from your own club. Alibi witnesses with GPS data, fuel receipts, delivery signatures, and helmet camera footage. But yes, from my own club." Mason paused. "I understand why you see that as a problem. I'm asking you to look at it as evidence." Kincaid stood up. "You'll have a chance to present that to your attorney." He was almost to the door when Mason spoke again, quietly. "Sheriff." Kincaid stopped. "That girl you left behind in that house this morning, she's got a heart condition that was diagnosed 6 months ago. She's managing it, but the management requires consistency. I know you had a warrant, and I know you were doing your job. I'm not saying you did anything wrong that couldn't be explained by the rules you were following." Mason's voice didn't waver. "But she's alone right now, and she's frightened, and nobody in this town knows her well enough to just show up and sit with her. If there's any part of what I just told you that sounds like the kind of thing a guilty man would say, I'd appreciate you thinking about the answer to that. Kincaid stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. He did not turn around. He walked out. Rachel Monroe sat at her desk and looked at her notebook. She looked at what she'd written about the lock, about the camera gap, about the dust that wasn't on the cases. And then she opened her computer and pulled the evidence log for the items recovered from Mason's garage. And she did something that wasn't technically outside her duties, but was very much outside the direction the investigation was heading. She requested the clinic's full inventory records for the last 6 months. It took 20 minutes for the clerk to send them over, and when Rachel opened the file, she sat quietly for a long time, reading. Then she pulled up the manufacturer's distribution records for the same product lines. Cross-referenced the batch numbers. Read them again. The medication that had been stolen was listed in the clinic's records as nearing the end of its usable shelf life. The manufacturer's records showed that those same batch numbers had been produced 4 months ago. Medication produced 4 months ago did not have an expiration problem. Not for these compounds. The shelf life was 18 months minimum. Someone had changed the clinic's records to show a product nearing expiration for medication that had more than a year of usable life remaining. Rachel sat very still. This was not a missing detail. This was not a gap in the recording that might have an innocent explanation. This was someone with access to the clinic's inventory system deliberately falsifying records on a specific batch of high-value medication. She thought about what that meant. Then she thought about why someone might stage a robbery of medication they had already marked as expiring medication that would be written off as a loss without detailed investigation. That wouldn't trigger insurance scrutiny because the paperwork already showed it was almost worthless anyway. She thought about who had access to clinic inventory records. She thought about the anonymous tip called in at exactly the moment the garage camera came back online. She closed her notebook, opened a new one. 3 miles away, at the house Lena Callahan was sitting in alone, a piece of paper appeared under the front door. Lena didn't hear anyone approach. She was in the kitchen, sitting with the blue notebook open in front of her. And Mrs. Yardley had come and gone an hour ago with clear instructions and a casserole dish that Lena hadn't touched. The house felt enormous in the specific way that houses feel enormous when the person who fills them is somewhere else. She noticed the paper because the edge of it caught the morning light from the hallway window. She walked to the door and picked it up. It had been folded once, and when she opened it, there were 8 words in block letters, printed with a felt-tip pen that had been pressed hard enough to emboss the paper. Tell your father to confess, or the next missing shipment gets blamed on every vest in his club. Lena read it twice. Her hands were completely steady. Her chest felt like something inside it had quietly turned to stone. She reached for her phone and called Rachel Monroe's direct line because her father had told her once casually. In the way he told her things, he considered important that if anything ever went sideways, Deputy Monroe was the one person in the sheriff's department who wrote everything down. When Rachel picked up, Lena's voice was calm. "Someone just put a threat under my door," she said. "I think my father's being set up, and I think whoever did it is scared that he's going to be believed." Rachel Monroe picked up her second notebook, the new one, and started writing. Outside, the Arizona sun was fully risen now, and the gravel of Mason Callahan's property was hot enough to feel through boot soles. And inside the sheriff's department, Mason sat in a holding cell and stared at the wall and thought about the mercy run and the faces of the people they delivered to. And he thought about Lena. And he thought about the fact that the cases had been sitting under his canvas without any desert dust on them at all. Somewhere in this county, someone had thought very carefully about what the town of Red Mesa would believe before they bothered to ask. And they had been right. And Mason Callahan sat in a cell on a blisteringly hot Arizona morning and waited not with defeat, not with rage, but with the specific, grounded patience of a man who had ridden through smoke before and knew that clarity, when it came to the people still standing in it. The badge on Kincaid's chest meant something to him. Mason knew that. The question was whether it meant more than the story Kincaid had already told himself. That was the only question that mattered now. And somebody in Red Mesa was very, very afraid of what happened if the answer turned out to be yes. Rachel Monroe had not gone home. She had not eaten. She had barely moved from her desk in 4 hours, and the two notebooks in front of her were filling in a way that made her feel simultaneously more certain and more afraid, the specific combination that meant she was getting close to something that someone else did not want found. The threat delivered to Lena's door was logged, photographed, and sitting in an evidence sleeve on the corner of Rachel's desk. 8 words in block print, felt tip pen. Hard enough pressure to emboss the paper from the front side, which meant the person writing it had either been angry or had wanted it to feel authoritative. Maybe both. Rachel had bagged it carefully, and she kept looking at it the way you look at a thing that knows more than it's telling you yet. Lena had given her the envelope. There was no envelope. The paper had come folded, and her statement, and Rachel had watched a 22-year-old woman with a cardiac condition and a father in a holding cell sit across from her and speak in a voice that was so deliberately controlled it almost broke Rachel in half. Not the fragility, the discipline. Lena Callahan had her father's composure, and it was clearly something they'd built together over years. A kind of structural integrity that didn't come from nothing. "Does your father have enemies?" Rachel asked. Lena considered the question as though it deserved a real answer, and not just a reflexive no. "My father has people who are uncomfortable around him," she said finally. "That's different from enemies. The vest makes people uncomfortable. The way he lives makes people uncomfortable. He fixes cars and delivers water, and doesn't go to church on Sunday, and doesn't care who knows it. And that's enough in a town like this to make you the wrong kind of person before you've done anything. Anyone specific. Anyone who would know his garage layout, his camera, his lock." Lena was quiet. "Then, he services vehicles for about 30 businesses in a 40-mile radius. County vehicles, private contractors, medical transport. Anyone who brought their vehicle in would have been inside that garage at some point." Rachel wrote that down. "Medical transport," she said. "He's had county contractor vehicles in there maybe a dozen times in the past 2 years. Vans mostly. The ones that do the rural supply runs." Rachel wrote that down too, and underlined it and did not tell Lena why. After Lena left, Mrs. Yardley had come back to drive her, and Rachel had watched them go with a feeling she could only describe as protective unease. Rachel opened the clinic inventory records again and started building a timeline on a fresh page. She wrote dates in the left margin, batch numbers across the top, and she started filling in what matched and what didn't, cross-referencing against the manufacturer's shipping records, and the shape that emerged from the data was not subtle. It was not something you could explain away as clerical error or negligence. Someone had been systematically altering inventory records to make valuable medication appear to be expiring. Not all of it. Specific batches. The batches that matched high-value compounds, cardiac medication, insulin analogs, emergency coagulants. The kind of medication that rural clinics stocked for the patients who had no other access, and the kind of medication that had a robust secondary market if you knew the right channels. This had been going on, based on what Rachel could reconstruct from the records, for at least 3 years. 3 years of altered records. 3 years of medication reported as waste, or loss, or end-of-shelf disposal. And somewhere in those 3 years, the real product had been moving through channels that never appeared in any official document Rachel had access to. She sat back and pressed her palms flat on the desk. Because what this meant, if she was reading it correctly, and she was increasingly certain she was that the robbery at the clinic last night was not about stealing medication. The medication in those cases was already spoken for, already allocated to whatever private network had been receiving diverted supplies for 3 years. The robbery was about something else. The robbery was about creating a documented loss event, a dramatic, visible, explained loss that would cover the most recent diversion without anyone asking where the real product had gone. And Mason Callahan, with his leather vest and his Hells Angels patch and his garage on the western edge of town, had been selected as the explanation because the town would accept him as the explanation before they finished reading the headline. Rachel stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called county's medical contractor database and asked for the service and repair records associated with county contractor vehicles over the past 24 months. The clerk on the other end sighed audibly. It was not a small request, but Rachel's tone contained something that communicated this was not the kind of request that went to the bottom of the pile. While she waited, she went to do the one thing she'd been putting off since she'd logged Mason's vest into evidence. The evidence room was quiet. She checked out the vest under her own name and carried it to her desk and set it in front of her. It was heavier than it looked, real leather, well worn, the kind of weight that accumulated over years of use rather than the stiffness of something new. The Hell's Angels patch was on the back, exactly as expected. The colors correct, the stitching tight and even. She turned the vest over carefully. And there, on the inner lining beneath the main patch on the back panel, was a secondary piece, smaller, older. The stitching was hand-done, uneven in places, with a section near the bottom right corner that had been repaired with red thread that didn't quite match the original color. And in the lower left of the patch, partially obscured by the edge of the main panel, was a small irregular mark, darkened and stiff, that could only have come from heat. A burn mark. Rachel read the patch carefully. Desert Mercy Road Captain, 2008. She sat very still with the vest in her hands. 2008. She knew that year. It was a year that had its own weight in Red Mesa, the kind of weight that certain years carry when they've held something catastrophic. The wildfire of 2008 had started in the eastern reaches of the county and moved faster than the fire services had modeled. And by the time the evacuation orders reached the outlying rural areas, certain roads were already impassable to standard emergency vehicles. There had been an incident documented in the local paper, in the sheriff's department's own after-action report, in the county's emergency services records, involving a group of motorcycle riders who had moved through roads that trucks couldn't navigate, carrying injured residents, guiding trapped families toward the evacuation corridor. They had never been identified. The after-action report referred to them as unaffiliated civilian volunteers on motorcycles. The county had sent a formal letter of commendation to an address that turned out to be a P.O. box, and the letter had never been claimed. Rachel stood up and walked down the hallway to the section of the building where photographs and commendations lined the wall, the department's institutional memory, the kind of display that nobody looked at after the first week of working there. She scanned the frames until she found what she was looking for. A newspaper clipping, enlarged and mounted. August 14, 2008. A photograph taken by a journalist who had been embedded with the emergency services. Smoke in the background, thick enough to make the image look like it was taken through gauze. A group of motorcycles in the foreground, riders in leather vests, one of them carrying a child on his arm, and at the center of the image, closest to the camera, a broad-shouldered man with his face turned 3/4 away from the lens. Blonde hair tied back. On the back of his vest, partially visible, a patch. The patch was too small in the image to read the full text, but the shape of it, and visible even in the aged newsprint, a small dark mark in the lower left corner, was not something Rachel needed a magnifying glass to recognize. She went back to her desk, placed Mason's vest beside her notebook, and compared them. The burn mark in the photograph, the burn mark on the vest, the hand-stitched red thread in the photograph's corner, the hand-stitched red thread on the vest in front of her. She was looking at the same object. Mason Callahan had been one of the riders in the 2008 wildfire, possibly the one closest to the camera, the man who had been carrying a child. This did not prove he was innocent of last night's robbery. Rachel was disciplined enough to hold that truth clearly. Evidence was evidence, and sentiment was sentiment, and you did not let one become the other. But it proved something else, something that was, in its own way, equally important. It proved that the town's story about Mason Callahan was incomplete, in a direction that the town had never thought to look. They had seen the patch and built a narrative around it that had no room for a man who rode through wildfire smoke to carry children to safety. She picked up her phone and called Kincaid's office. He picked up on the second ring. Monroe. I need 5 minutes with you, she said. About the vest. A pause. I've got the county attorney on the other line. After the county attorney, then, but today. Before end of shift. Another pause. Longer. Is this about the case? Yes. Does it change the physical evidence we recovered from the garage? Rachel looked at her notebooks, at the inventory records, at the burn mark on the vest, at the threat that had been delivered to a 22-year-old girl's door in block letters with a felt-tip pen, pressed hard enough to emboss the paper. It doesn't change what we found, she said carefully. It changes what it means. Kincaid's voice flattened. I'll call you when I'm off with the county attorney. He did not call her. By 4 in the afternoon, he had not called, and Rachel had stopped waiting for it and kept working. The contractor vehicle records arrived by email at 4:18, 42 pages. Rachel opened them and started reading, and she had been reading for about 20 minutes when she found the name. Grant Voss, county medical contractor. Operating under the license of Voss Regional Health Transport, established 7 years ago. Service and repair records for 8 county contractor vehicles over the past 2 years, all brought to Mason Callahan's garage. The most recent service call was 11 days ago. 11 days ago, Grant Voss had been inside Mason Callahan's garage. Rachel set down the pages. She thought about what that meant in practical terms. A man who had been inside that garage 11 days ago would have seen the layout, would have noted the security camera position, would have had a reason, if he was paying attention, to look at the lock on the rear door, would have understood, if he was the kind of person who thought about these things, that a rear entrance accessible by a professional bypass tool was a viable route in and out without disturbing the front of the property. She picked up her phone to call Kincaid again, and it rang in her hand before she could dial. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered. Deputy, a woman's voice. Precise, controlled, with the kind of careful articulation that suggested she was measuring every word before she let it out. My name is Dr. Naomi Brooks. I'm the clinical director at Red Mesa Community Clinic. I need to speak with you about the robbery. Rachel sat up straight. Dr. Brooks. Thank you for calling. I was going to reach out to... I know what you were going to ask, Doctor. Brooks said, cutting across her, gently but firmly. I've been expecting someone to ask it for a long time. The inventory records don't match because they've been altered. I know that because I flagged the discrepancy 14 months ago and was told to let it go. Rachel's pen was already moving. Who told you to let it go? A brief silence. The county administrator's office. Specifically, a message conveyed through my department head, attributed to an unnamed source who had authority over our contractor relationships. Grant Voss, Rachel said. Another silence, longer this time. I did not say that name, Doctor. Brooks, I have service records placing Voss in Mason Callahan's garage 11 days before the robbery. I have inventory records showing systematic alteration of expiration data on high-value medication going back 3 years. I have 2 cases of stolen medication sitting in an evidence room with no desert dust on them, a bypass lock, and a 17-minute camera gap. I'm not asking you to testify right now. I'm asking you to tell me if the pattern I'm seeing is the pattern you've been living inside. Doctor. Brooks let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a very long time. The medication that was stolen last night was not nearing expiration, she said. It had 14 months of shelf life remaining. I know because I received the delivery manifest myself, and I compared it against what appeared in the inventory system 48 hours later. 48 hours after delivery, someone had already altered the record. Yes. And reported it as expiring stock that would need to be written off. Yes. Rachel looked at the threat note in its evidence sleeve. Dr. Brooks, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. Before last night, before the robbery, did anyone suggest to you, directly or indirectly, that it might be better for you personally if you didn't continue asking questions about the inventory discrepancies. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Rachel Monroe had heard all day. I received a message 3 weeks ago, Dr. Brooks said finally, through a channel I can't immediately explain without providing more context. It indicated that my contract renewal, which is coming up in 8 weeks, might face complications if I continued raising concerns about supply documentation. That's a threat. I interpreted it as a professional caution. With respect, Dr. Brooks, that's the same thing with better vocabulary. Another breath. I have copies of the emails, she said. My own internal communications requesting review. The responses I received. The altered manifests side by side with the delivery confirmations. I've had them on a personal drive for 14 months because I didn't know who to give them to. You can give them to me, Rachel said. Tonight. Wherever is comfortable for you. They arranged to meet at 6 o'clock at a location, Dr. Brooks specified not the clinic, not the sheriff's department. Somewhere in between that was public enough to provide safety in plain sight. Rachel hung up and sat for a moment with both hands flat on the desk. She was thinking about timing, about how long this had been running, about the specificity of the plan that had placed Mason Callahan in handcuffs this morning while the actual mechanism of the scheme stayed invisible, but the right kind of paper trails and the right kind of reputation. Because that was the thing about Grant Voss that was becoming clearer the more Rachel read. He was not invisible. He was visible in all the right ways. He attended county budget meetings. He sponsored the annual health fair. His name appeared on 3 donor plaques in the clinic's waiting room. He was the kind of person who made an authority like Kincaid feel that his instincts were correctly calibrated, because Kincaid's instincts said to trust the man with his name on the plaques and distrust the man with the patch on his back. And Voss understood that. Voss had almost certainly counted on it. At 5:40, Rachel went back to Kincaid's office. He was off the phone now, reviewing paperwork that had the deliberate quality of something organized to demonstrate busyness. I need to tell you what I've found, she said. Kincaid looked up. Monroe, the warrant was clean. The physical evidence is solid. The county attorney is all ready. The cases have no dust on them, Rachel said. They've been in that garage less than an hour. The lock was bypassed electronically. The camera was killed for 17 minutes. The medication was altered in the clinic's records to show a false expiration date. The batch numbers match manufacturer records showing 14 months of remaining shelf life. Grant Voss serviced his county vehicles in Mason Callahan's garage 11 days ago, and the clinic's own director has 14 months of emails documenting discrepancies she was pressured to ignore. Kincaid had stopped looking at his paperwork. This isn't about Mason, Rachel said. It was never about Mason. He was selected because you would believe it. The whole town would believe it. And whoever built this scheme counted on exactly that. Kincaid sat with that for a long moment. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man who is working very hard to hold 2 conflicting truths in the same space, the truth he arrived with this morning, and the truth that is dismantling it piece by piece while he watches. That's a significant set of claims without a complete evidentiary chain, he said. I know that, Rachel said, which is why I'm telling you before I meet with Dr. Brooks at 6 o'clock and receive the emails she's been holding for 14 months. Kincaid was quiet for a long moment. You arranged that meeting without department authorization. I arranged it without advance notice because I didn't know she was going to call me this afternoon. I'm telling you now. And the vehicle records the Voss service history. Came from the county contractor database through a standard records request. Everything I've done today is within my authorized scope. She paused. I'm not going around you. I'm bringing this to you. But I need you to hear it. Kincaid stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her. Rachel waited. She was very good at waiting. It was the skill that produced the second notebook and the third, the habit of stillness in the face of information that needed time to settle. Don't go to that meeting alone, he said finally. His voice was different, not soft. Kincaid didn't do soft, but something had shifted in it. The specific shift of a man setting down something he'd been carrying without knowing its weight. Take Sandoval with you. Yes, sir. And he turned around. If what you're telling me is correct, if there's a supply diversion scheme running through county contractor channels, then someone put a threat under a young woman's door this morning to stop that from being discovered. And the man we have in holding right now took our handcuffs without resistance because he trusted that the truth would come out. Yes, Rachel said. That means someone in this county is scared enough of the truth to threaten a 22-year-old girl. He looked at her steadily. I want to know who that is before they do something that can't be undone. Rachel picked up her notebooks. At the door, she stopped. Sheriff, one more thing. What? She had the evidence photograph in her hand, the 2008 wildfire image. The one from the hallway. She set it on his desk. Beside it, she sets a close-up photograph she'd taken of the burn mark and the red thread on Mason's vest. Kincaid looked at the photographs. He said nothing. He was there, Rachel said quietly. In the fire. 2008. One of the riders who went in when the emergency vehicles couldn't. The patch you put in evidence this morning was in that garage 12 years before you put it there. She paused at the door. I just thought you should know what you were looking at. She left him with the photographs. What Rachel could not have known, because she had only Kincaid's professional face to read, and Kincaid was practiced at keeping his professional face separate from everything underneath it, was that the 2008 wildfire was not an abstraction to Owen Kincaid. It was not a historical event he knew through department records. His wife, Sarah, had been 6 months pregnant. They'd been at her parents' house on the eastern side of the county when the fire jumped the ridge faster than anyone had predicted. The roads out were gone in 40 minutes. The evacuation team had not reached their section, and a group of motorcycle riders had come through smoke so thick that Sarah told the story later by saying she'd heard them before she saw them, the sound of engines through the black air, and then hands helping her into a position where she could be moved, and a voice telling her to hold on, to keep breathing, that they were going to get her out. The man who had helped her most directly had a blonde ponytail and a vest. She had never seen his face clearly. By the time the smoke had thinned enough for visibility, the riders were already going back in. Their daughter, Sarah, and Owen's daughter, was born 2 weeks later. Healthy, on time, named Claire, which was what Sarah had decided because of how she had felt when the riders came out of the smoke. Kincaid sat at his desk with Rachel's photographs in front of him, and something that had been calcified in a particular shape inside his chest for 26 years and then reinforced over all the years after his brother died, something that had become so structural. He'd stopped being able to see it as a choice began, very slowly and with considerable internal resistance, to shift. He picked up the phone and called the holding area. Don't process Callahan any further tonight, he said. Hold everything where it is. The deputy on the other end sounded confused. Sir, the county attorney's office was expecting. I'll handle the county attorney's office, Kincaid said. Nothing moves on this case tonight until I say so. He hung up and sat for a very long time. Then he pulled the case file toward him and started reading it from the beginning. Not for confirmation, for the first time. Outside the sheriff's department, in a parking lot across the street, a vehicle sat with its engine running. The driver had a phone pressed to his ear. When the call connected, his voice was low and controlled, though the control was the kind that required active maintenance. They're looking at the inventory records, he said. The deputy Monroe, she requested the contractor database this afternoon. She's meeting someone tonight. A pause. Tonight. Another pause. Longer. I understand. I'll handle the storage question before morning. He ended the call and set his phone on the passenger seat and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. His name was on 3 donor plaques in the clinic's waiting room, and he had sat in budget meetings with Owen Kincaid for 6 years, and he had chosen Mason Callahan as his solution to a problem that had been growing for 3 years because he'd understood, with the accurate cruelty of a man who knew how a town thought, that the patch would do the work for him. But the patch had not done all of it. And now a 31-year-old deputy with 2 notebooks was meeting with the clinic director at 6 o'clock and by morning the contractor database would have given her what she needed to make the connection. Grant Voss started his engine and pulled out of the lot, and he drove toward the storage facility where the latest diverted shipment was still waiting for transfer. And he made plans of the kind that become available to people when they evidence against them is more dangerous than the act of destroying it. He did not know that Rachel Monroe had already photographed the inventory records and stored them on a server she controlled independently of the department network. He did not know that Dr. Naomi Brooks had been driving toward the meeting location for the past 20 minutes with a copy of 14 months of emails on a drive in her coat pocket. And he did not know that Wade Calloway, who was Mason Callahan's closest friend and the chapter's logistics coordinator, and a man who had been awake since 3 in the moment the alert went through the chapter network, had spent the entire day assembling something that was going to walk through the door of the Red Mesa Sheriff's Department in the morning and be impossible to dismiss. In the holding cell, Mason Callahan sat on the narrow bench and leaned his back against the wall and closed his eyes. Not sleeping, thinking. He was building the timeline in his mind, the mercy run, the route, the fuel stop, the delivery signatures, the faces of the people who had signed for the water cases and the medical coolers and the generators in the communities that had gone dark after the power failure. He was placing himself minute by minute in a location that was not this county and had not been this county for most of the window in question. He thought about the 9 minutes. There had been a 9-minute gap in his helmet camera footage battery failure, a known issue with that particular unit, and he'd been off the main route at the time. He'd seen the van on the side road, medical transport markings, back end partially open. The driver was unconscious in the cab. Mason had stopped, because that was what Mason Callahan did. He stopped, and he made sure the driver was breathing and not in immediate danger. And he'd taken photographs with his phone because the rear compartment had contained clinic containers that he'd recognized as the same type used for the temperature-controlled medication runs. He had the photographs on his phone. His phone was in the evidence bag with his belt and his keys and his wallet. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling and said nothing. Someone would find the thread. Rachel Monroe would find the thread because his daughter had called her and because Rachel Monroe wrote everything down. That was the thing about truth. It did not disappear just because someone had built a careful story on top of it. It waited, patient as desert ground after rain, waiting for the moment when the weight of the false thing above it could no longer hold. Mason Callahan could wait too. Outside, the Arizona evening was cooling into that particular dry clarity that the desert offered at dusk, and somewhere on a highway 78 miles from Red Mesa, Wade Calloway was on the phone with 6 chapter representatives, coordinating what was going to be the largest organized arrival of evidence and testimony this county had ever seen from a group that the county had spent 30 years trying to make invisible. They were going to be very visible tomorrow, and they were going to make it impossible for the truth to keep waiting. Wade Calloway had not slept. He had driven through the night on 4 hours of highway that crossed 2 county lines, and by the time the eastern sky was beginning to suggest the idea of morning, without committing to it, he had made 41 phone calls, sent 63 text messages, coordinated fuel stops across 3 chapters, and assembled something that no anonymous tip and no stack of falsified records had anticipated. 71 people who had all been in the same place at the same time, each of them carrying documentation that proved it. All of them moving toward Red Mesa with the organized calm of people who understood that what they did in the next 12 hours was going to matter for a very long time. He stopped at a gas station 20 miles outside town and called Rachel Monroe's direct line. It was 5:47 in the morning. She picked up immediately, which told him she also had not slept. "We're 20 minutes out," he said. 71 riders. Every man and woman who was on the Mercy Run has their documentation. GPS fuel receipts, delivery confirmations, dash camera recordings, helmet camera footage. I've got 6 riders with time-stamped medical delivery signatures from communities that are 40 to 90 miles from the clinic. I need to know where to bring this. Rachel was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Bring it to the front entrance of the sheriff's department. Park in the public lot. Walk in with the documents. Do not bring anything that isn't paper or a recording device. Understood, Wade. Her voice shifted slightly. How many people in this county know you're coming by now? He glanced at his phone's message count. Probably most of them. She said nothing for a moment, and he could hear her thinking. Okay, she said. I'll be at the front door. She was already at Kincaid's office when she hung up. She knocked and opened the door in the same motion, because Kincaid's light was on, and she could hear him moving inside. He looked like a man who had also not slept. And unlike Rachel, who wore sleeplessness cleanly, it sat on Kincaid with visible weight. The photographs she'd left on his desk the night before were still there, in the same position. He'd been looking at them. The Hells Angels chapter is 20 minutes out, Rachel said. 71 riders. They have the full Mercy Run documentation. Kincaid looked at her. All of them. Every rider who was on the route. Wade Calloway organized it overnight. Kincaid stood up. How is the town going to read this, honestly? Not well. At first, she held his gaze. But that's the point, isn't it? The town reads the patch and sees a threat. Calloway knows that. He's coming anyway. With paper instead of weapons and documentation instead of demands. She paused. That tells you something about what kind of people they are. Kincaid was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened and reached for his jacket. Get Sandoval and Torres. I want a perimeter that is respectful, not confrontational. Nobody puts a hand on a holster unless there is an actual, immediate physical threat. And Monroe, I want you receiving the documentation directly. Chain of custody starts the moment it comes through that door. Yes, sir. And somebody call the county attorney's office and tell them not to file anything else until I personally authorize it. Rachel was already moving. The news spread through Red Mesa the way news spreads through small towns, not through any single channel, but through the aggregate of everyone telling one person who told 2 more. And by 6:30, and there were people standing on sidewalks and in doorways, along the main road, because someone had said that 100 bikers were coming, and that was the number that lodged in the collective imagination and grew on its own. Patsy Gorman called Harold Birch. Harold Birch called the county administrator's office and got a voicemail. 3 parents called the elementary school to ask whether it would be open. The pastor of First Methodist posted on the community board, asking people to remain calm. Somebody else posted a response that had 17 exclamation points. And the phrase, "We knew this would happen," without specifying what exactly they had known or when. In his vehicle, parked at the edge of the commercial district with a clear line of sight to the main road, Grant Voss watched his phone and waited for news from the storage facility. He had sent 2 men there before midnight. They had confirmed arrival. They had confirmed access. He had confirmed access. He had been waiting since then for confirmation that the transfer was complete, that the remaining inventory had been moved to the secondary location outside county jurisdiction, and that the storage building's records had been sanitized. The confirmation had not come. He called the first number. Voicemail. He called the second. It rang 8 times and then stopped without going to voicemail, which was the specific kind of non-answer that produced a cold and specific fear in a man who was already operating at the outer edge of what his composure could hold. He put the phone in his pocket and sat very still and thought about what that might mean. And then he decided that, whatever it meant, the more immediate problem was arriving from the highway in 20 minutes with documentation that was going to make Rachel Monroe's already dangerous notebooks look like rough notes. He pulled out his phone again and called his attorney. The riders came into Red Mesa at 6:54 in the morning, and they came the way Wade had told them to come, single file at legal speed, helmets on until they reached the public lot, engines at normal idle rather than revved. No formation riding, no slow roll theater, nothing that could be photographed and repackaged as intimidation. They filled the public parking lot in organized rows with the precision of people who had ridden together long enough to do it without instruction, and they cut their engines in a rolling sequence that produced a descending silence. And then 71 people removed their helmets and sat on their bikes and waited. People on the sidewalk stared. The riders did not stare back. They talked to each other quietly. Someone passed a water bottle. A woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and a Hell's Angels vest adjusted her gloves and said something to the man beside her that made him laugh, a real laugh. Brief and genuine, not performance. That laugh, more than anything else, confused the people watching. Because a person who comes to do violence does not laugh like that. A person who comes to frighten you does not check their neighbor's water bottle. And the watching part of Red Mesa, which was most of it by now, had to stand on its sidewalks and confront the specific discomfort of a picture that did not match what it had been told to expect. Wade Calloway walked through the front entrance of the sheriff's department at 7:02 with a cardboard banker's box under each arm, and Rachel Monroe held the door and signed the first chain of custody log before he'd set the boxes on the intake table. There are 9 more boxes in the first 6 bikes, Wade said, and 17 riders with footage on their devices that we can transfer directly to your evidence system. Rachel looked at the boxes. Walk me through the structure. Box 1 is GPS histories, printed and on drives for all 71 riders, time-stamped and geotagged for the entire Mercy Run route from departure to return. Box 2 is fuel receipts, organized by timestamp and location. Every stop is documented. The farthest stop from Red Mesa is 91 miles. He paused. Mason's GPS puts him 78 miles from the clinic at the midpoint of the robbery window. His farthest point from here was 91 miles. He got there, delivered supplies, turned around, and the 9-minute gap in his helmet camera footage. Wade's expression didn't change, but something moved behind it. 4th box. Mason pulled over at 11:23. There's a side road off the main Mercy Run route, unmarked, used by county contractor vehicles for rural supply access. He pulled over because there was a county-marked medical transport van with its rear doors open and an unconscious driver in the cab. He's got 12 photographs on his personal phone, still in evidence showing the van, the driver, the rear compartment. The rear compartment had clinic containers in it, empty, but the same type used for temperature-controlled medication runs. Rachel's were writing. The van's registration. It's visible in 2 of the photographs. Partial plate. We ran it this morning through a contact in the DMV. He looked at her steadily. It's registered to Voss Regional Health Transport. The room went very quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when a piece of information lands that everyone present understands is the weight-bearing piece, the one that, if you remove it, the structure above it has no support. Rachel finished writing the sentence. She capped her pen. She looked up at Wade. You know that partial plate is not admissible confirmation. I know, Wade said. That's your job. I'm just telling you where to look. She nodded slowly. The driver. Do you know who was driving? Mason's photographs show a man in a Voss regional uniform, unconscious in the cab. The photographs have metadata timestamp, coordinates. Wade set his jaw. If you pull the Voss regional dispatch records from that night and find out who was scheduled for that route, you'll have a name. And that person is either a victim of whatever Voss was running or a participant. Either way, they were in that van, at that location at that time. Rachel stood up. I need to bring this to Sheriff Kincaid now. Before you go, Wade said. He put his hand in his vest pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. Mason asked me to give you this, if I got the chance. He wrote it last night in the holding cell. Gave it to the overnight deputy. He set it on the table between them. He said you'd know what to do with it. Rachel unfolded it. Mason's handwriting was plain, and even the handwriting of a man who thought before he wrote. The note said, check the van, check the driver's log, check the expiration dates on the containers in the rear compartment against what the clinic reported stolen. The containers in the photographs are empty. What was in them was already gone before the robbery was staged. That's why the robbery was staged, not to steal the supply. To explain why the supply was missing, Rachel read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and added it to the chain of custody log and picked up her notebooks and went to find Kincaid. He was on the phone when she knocked. He held up a finger 1 minute, and she stood in the doorway and waited. And she could tell from the side of the conversation, she could hear that the county attorney's office was pushing back on the hold she'd requested the night before. "I understand your timeline," Kincaid said into the phone. "I'm telling you that new evidence has arrived this morning that changes the evidentiary picture materially." "Yes, material. I will provide a written summary within the hour." He paused. "Listening, I understand that." "Then the answer is no, not until I've reviewed what's in front of me." Another pause. Shorter. "Good day." He set the phone down. "Tell me," Rachel told him. "All of it, the GPS data, the fuel receipts, the delivery signatures, the partial plate, Mason's note, the photographs on his phone that could be accessed through the evidence log right now if Kincaid authorized it, the Voss Regional Dispatch records that a single formal request could produce within the hour." Kincaid listened without interrupting, which was not his typical mode. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and he listened. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The van," he said. "If we pull the dispatch log and someone was scheduled to run that route that night, we have a witness to the van's location," Rachel said. "Unconscious but present. And Mason has 12 photographs, placing him at that location during the 9-minute gap in his helmet footage. That's not a gap anymore. That's documented evidence of what he was doing during the only unverified window." Kincaid reached for his phone. He called the records desk. He put in a formal request for Voss Regional Health Transport dispatch records for the previous 48 hours. He authorized access to Mason's personal phone through the evidence log. He put down the phone and looked at Rachel. "Issue Mason Callahan a temporary release on humanitarian grounds, pending continued investigation," he said. "His daughter's medical situation is documented, and his risk of flight is." He stopped. He didn't run this morning when he had 4 patrol vehicles in his driveway. He's not going to run now. Rachel was already writing the release order. "I'll process it immediately." "And Monroe?" She looked up. "The 71 riders in my parking lot. I want you to go out there and tell them personally that their documentation is being received and logged into evidence under my direct authorization. Tell them." He paused, and something in his face shifted in a way she had not seen before. A loosening of the set that she had always assumed was just how his face was structured. "Tell them that their cooperation is appreciated." Those exact words. Rachel looked at him for a moment. "Yes, sir." She went out through the front entrance and walked to the edge of the parking lot where Wade was standing with several other riders, and she spoke clearly enough for the people nearby to hear. "Sheriff Kincaid has authorized direct receipt of your documentation into the department's evidence system," she said. "He asked me to convey that your cooperation is appreciated. We'll need riders with digital footage to work with our tech unit for direct transfer. If you can organize that, we'll set up the transfer room immediately." Wade looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but the specific recalibration of a man who had prepared for a harder version of this morning and was allowing himself carefully to adjust. "We can do that," he said. And then Wade said something that Rachel didn't expect. He turned to the riders and spoke in a voice that carried. "I want everyone to hear this. We are guests in this parking lot. We are here as witnesses, not as a statement. Whatever happens today, we conduct ourselves the way we conducted ourselves on that mercy run, with discipline, with patience, and with respect for the process we're asking this town to trust." He paused. "Because if we ask them to believe Mason, we have to show them what Mason is made of. And Mason would not have wanted any version of this that couldn't be written up in a police report." The riders were quiet. Several of them nodded. On the sidewalk, across from the parking lot, Patsy Gorman was watching. She had her arms crossed, and her expression had the tight defensive quality of a person whose preconceptions are being challenged by direct evidence and who is not yet ready to let them go. But she was watching, and she kept watching. Inside the evidence room, Rachel accessed Mason's phone through the proper log and pulled up the photographs. 12 images. The first was the Van County medical transport markings, rear doors open, partial plate clearly visible in the right frame. The second was the driver unconscious, head against the window, Voss regional uniform. The next 6 showed the rear compartment, the empty clinic containers, their lot markings, and product codes visible on the side panels. She took photographs of the photographs. She emailed the image files to the state investigator contact she had established through a case the previous year, along with a brief memo that used the phrase potential medical supply with county contractor involvement and requested an urgent response. She was back at her desk when her radio crackled. It was Torres from the overnight unit, and his voice had a quality in it that made the back of Rachel's neck respond before her brain had processed the words. Monroe, we've got a situation at the Voss Regional Storage Facility on County Road 7. Structure fire. Responding units are en route. Dispatch is showing the building as a pause with interference, as currently occupied. We've got an evidence tech who is running a court-authorized check on related records. She's inside. Rachel was on her feet and moving before he'd finished the sentence. The drive to County Road 7 took 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes, 3 things happened simultaneously. The fire units arrived at the storage facility and confirmed an active structure fire in the rear section of the building. The evidence tech, a woman named Jody Farrell, 28 years old, who had been inside running a records check on Voss's transportation logs per Rachel's authorized request from the previous evening, was not responding on her radio. And Mason Callahan, who had just received his temporary release paperwork and was being walked to the processing desk to receive his personal effects, heard the call come over the department radio and stopped walking. The deputy beside him said, "Mr. Callahan, we need to finish processing that storage facility," Mason said. "Who was inside, sir? We need you too." His voice was still quiet, still even. But something in it had changed, the way a cable changes when the tension on it moves from operational load to stress load. Jody Farrell. I heard her name on the radio. She's Mick Farrell's daughter. She grew up 4 blocks from my garage. The deputy hesitated. Mason turned and looked at him with complete directness. "I know that building. I've serviced vehicles out of that yard. I know the layout. I know which sections have ventilation and which don't. If she's in the rear section and the fire is in the rear section, she has maybe 12 minutes before the smoke concentration in that part of the structure reaches the level where it doesn't matter what her training says." The deputy looked at his radio, looked at Mason. "Son," Mason said, "give me the release form. I'll sign it right now. And then you are going to let me get in a vehicle and go to that building, because I am not going to stand in this hallway while a 28-year-old woman dies in a fire that was set because someone in this county is panicking about exactly what she was looking for." The deputy handed him the form. Mason signed it in 4 seconds and was out the door in 5. Wade was still in the parking lot. He saw Mason come through the front entrance moving fast, and he was off his bike and beside him in seconds. What happened? Storage facility fire. Jody Farrell is inside. Voss's building on County Road 7. He was already at Wade's bike. "I need to get there." Wade threw him the keys without a word. Mason caught them and was on the bike and out of the lot before half the riders had processed what was happening. And then Wade turned to the remaining riders and said 3 words. County Road 7. 9 riders fell in behind the sound of Mason's engine, and they moved through the early morning streets of Red Mesa at legal speed, with the controlled urgency of people who have learned, through long practice, that panic costs you the seconds that discipline saves. Rachel arrived at the facility to find fire units working the rear section and a scene coordinator telling her in a raised voice that they did not have a confirmed location on Farrell. The front section of the building was accessible, but smoke compromised. The rear section was where the fire had started, and the records room was in the rear section, and the records room was where Farrell had been. Rachel put on a borrowed respirator and was arguing with the scene coordinator about entry points when Mason Callahan pulled up on Wade's bike and was off it before the engine stopped. The scene coordinator turned to stop him. Mason was already past him. The records room has a secondary access through the maintenance corridor on the north side, Mason said to Rachel, moving fast. The corridor has independent ventilation. If she moved toward the north wall when the fire started, which is what your training tells you to do, she's in a pocket that the main fire hasn't reached yet. Rachel fell in beside him. The scene coordinator shouted something behind them about unauthorized entry. Neither of them stopped. The maintenance corridor was where Mason said it would be. The ventilation was still partially functional. And 30 feet down the corridor, sitting against the north wall with her jacket pressed over her face and a data recorder held against her chest with both arms, was Jody Farrell, conscious, barely, coughing with the deep chest convulsiveness of someone who had been breathing bad air for too long, but alive. And when she heard Mason's voice, she looked up, and her eyes were clear enough to recognize that she had been found. "I've got you," Mason said, and he put his arm under hers and got her moving. Rachel took her other side. They came out through the north corridor exit into open air, and fire personnel converged immediately, taking Farrell from them, and she was coughing and talking at the same time, coughing and talking, and holding the data recorder against her chest with both arms, even while the paramedics worked around, not letting go of it because Jody Farrell was Mick Farrell's daughter, and she had grown up 4 blocks from Mason Callahan's garage door, and she understood, at some level below the smoke and the fear, that what she was holding was the reason someone had set this building on fire. Mason stood at the edge of the activity and breathed. Rachel stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Jody Farrell's voice came through the paramedic activity, rough with smoke but deliberate, the recorder. The data recorder from the van. It was in the secondary storage room, the fire-resistant cabinet. "I got it out. It's in my hands. Don't let anyone take it from my hands." Rachel moved toward her immediately. "Jody, I'm going to log it into evidence right now. I need you to hand it to me and state for the record what it is and where you found it." Farrell looked at her. Then she looked at Mason, who was standing 10 feet away, covered in corridor dust and breathing hard. "He came in for me," she said to Rachel, not quite as a question. "He did." Jody Farrell extended the data recorder toward Rachel with both hands. "Vehicle data recorder," she said, her voice steadying with each word. "Recovered from fire-resistant secondary storage. Voss Regional Health Transport Facility. County Road 7. Retrieved in conjunction with authorized records request." She paused for another cough. The cabinet it was in had Voss regional registration documents attached to it. The van in the records, the one this recorder belongs to, was scheduled for a route that passed the County Road 12 intersection on the night of the clinic robbery. She looked at Rachel directly. "That's the turnoff for the side road where Mason Callahan's photographs show an unconscious driver." Rachel logged it into evidence on her phone, standing in the open air outside a burning building, and she felt something that she could only have described as the specific sensation of a case closing around its truth, not finished yet, not resolved, but structurally complete, the frame fully visible now, even if the details were still coming in. She looked up and realized that Mason was no longer beside her. He was 20 feet away, on the phone, and his voice had the quality of a man working very hard to stay calm. She moved toward him and caught the end of the call. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said. "Don't let them move her until I get there." He ended the call, and his face, when he turned, was stripped of every layer of composure he'd spent the last 36 hours maintaining. "Lena," Rachel said, her pulse spiked. Mrs. Yardley called the paramedics. "They're with her now at the house." He looked at Rachel with an expression that was not panic, but was the thing that lives just beneath panic in a person who has decided they are not allowed to experience it. "I need to go." "Go," Rachel said immediately. "You're released. Your phone is in your personal effects bag in my vehicle. I'll get it to you at the house. Go." He was already moving toward Wade's bike. Wade appeared from somewhere in the organized chaos without being called, because that was what Wade Calloway did. He materialized where he was needed without requiring explanation. And Mason got on the bike, and Wade said nothing, just put a hand briefly on Mason's shoulder And then Mason was riding back toward Red Mesa with the Hells Angels patch visible on his back and the early morning light breaking fully now over the Arizona desert. Behind him, the storage facility fire was being contained. Inside the burning section, fire investigators would spend the next 2 hours confirming what the preliminary evidence already suggested. The fire had been started deliberately at multiple points by someone with access to the building and knowledge of where the most sensitive records were stored. What the arsonist had not known was that Jody Farrell had been working in the secondary records room rather than the primary one, because the primary records computer had frozen on startup and she'd moved to the backup terminal to continue. This was the kind of detail that turned large plans into exposed failures, the terminal that froze at the wrong moment. The evidence tech who moved rooms, the fire-resistant cabinet that held a data recorder, threw everything thrown at it. Grant Voss, watching the emergency response from 3 blocks away, understood within 20 minutes that the building was a loss, and, more critically, that the loss had not accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish. He could see, from his position, that someone had been brought out of the building alive. He could see the evidence logging activity. He could see, distantly, a data recorder being passed from a paramedic's side to a deputy's hands with the formality of a chain of custody transfer. He called his attorney again. This time, the attorney picked up, and the voice on the other end was different, flatter, more careful, and Voss understood from the first sentence that his attorney was already recalculating the geometry of his own involvement. "I need you to hear what I'm about to tell you," Voss said. "Grant, I think before we go any further, you need to understand that if what I'm hearing from the county is accurate, the scope of this, I need you to hear what I'm telling you." Grant. The attorney's voice was very flat now, very careful. "I cannot advise you on this matter any further until I understand the full scope of your exposure, and I am suggesting to you, as clearly as I am able, that you consider very carefully what you do in the next hour." Voss ended the call. He sat in his vehicle for 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes, the arithmetic of his situation completed itself with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its finality. The data recorder was in evidence. Farrell was alive and had logged it under her own statement. Mason Callahan was free. 71 riders were sitting in the sheriff's department parking lot with documentation that dismantled every piece of the frame he'd constructed. And Rachel Monroe had a state investigator's contact information and 14 months of Dr. Brooks's emails on an independent server. There was one road out of county that didn't pass through the main routes, an old service access rarely maintained. Voss had used it for transport runs because it avoided the way stations on the main highway. He started the engine. He did not know that Wade Calloway, who had organized 71 riders' documentation overnight with the logistical precision of a man who had run mercy operations in the dark for 16 years, had sent 2 riders to sit at that road 20 minutes ago. Not to stop him, not to confront him, simply to be there to watch and to call the number Rachel Monroe had given Wade before she left for County Road 7. The 2 Juros sat on their bikes at the junction, and when Voss's vehicle turned onto the service road and they called it in, Rachel Monroe relayed the location to the state police unit that had been mobilized at her request 40 minutes earlier, when she'd sent the memo about county contractor fraud and received, within 22 minutes, a response that used the phrase active investigation and included a direct callback number. The state police unit reached the service road in 7 minutes. Voss's vehicle was there, stopped. He had gotten out and was standing beside it in the desert morning with his hands at his sides, and the 2 Hells Angels riders were parked 50 yards back, not moving, not approaching, not doing anything except being present witnesses, as they had been on the Mercy Run, as they had been in the sheriff's department parking lot, as they had been through all of it. People who showed up and stayed and let the truth of their presence speak for itself. Grant Voss looked at the state police unit arriving in front of him and the 2 riders behind him and the open desert on both sides. And he understood, in the absolute and final way that people understand things when there is nowhere left to redirect the understanding that the scheme he had built on the assumption that a town would believe a patch before it believed a man had collapsed entirely. Not because the town had changed overnight, but because the man behind the patch had spent 30 years being exactly who he was, and that was not something that could be framed or staged or burned away. The state police officer stepped out of the vehicle. Grant Voss said nothing. He put his hands up. Miles away, in the house on the western edge of Red Mesa, Mason Callahan sat beside his daughter's bed and held her hand and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. Lena's pulse had stabilized. The paramedics were satisfied and had left their contact number and their instructions. Her color was returning, slowly, in the way that color returns to a person when the crisis has passed and the body begins the quiet work of recovery. She looked up at her father, at his face, which was dusty and worn and absolutely present, and she said, "Did they find it?" "They found it," Mason said. She closed her eyes. He kept holding her hand. Outside, the desert morning was fully here now, and 70 riders were parked in an orderly lot 3 miles away. And a data recorder was in a chain of custody bag in Rachel Monroe's vehicle, and Grant Voss was in the back of a state police unit on a service road that had never appeared on any map he'd trusted. Mason Callahan sat with his daughter and breathed, and let the morning be what it was. The data recorder spoke first. Rachel had it in the department's tech room by 9:30 in the morning, and the specialist who pulled the files, a quiet man named Garrett, who wore the same cardigan every day and had never once raised his voice in Rachel's memory, looked at his screen for about 40 seconds and then turned to her with an expression she had not seen on him before. "This vehicle was running," Garrett said. "Full telemetry. Speed, location, engine status, door sensors, everything." He pointed at the screen. "The night of the robbery, this van was active from 9:14 in the evening until," he scrolled, "until 11:31, at which point the engine cuts, the doors open, and the system logs a manual shutdown." Rachel leaned over his shoulder. "Where was it at 11:23? Garrett moved the cursor. "County Road 12 Junction, the turnoff for the unmarked service road." He paused. "It stopped there for 11 minutes, then moved again." "Mason's photographs are timestamped 11:24, Rachel said. "Coordinates match the turnoff." Garrett looked at her. "So the photographs put him at that location, at exactly the moment this vehicle's telemetry shows it stopped there?" "Yes. And the driver was unconscious in the cab," Rachel said. "Mason documented it. We have 12 photographs." She straightened up. "What's the driver log show for that night?" Garrett pulled the dispatch records that Rachel's formal request had produced an hour earlier. He cross-referenced the van's ID number. Scheduled driver was a man named Curtis Howell, Voss regional employee, 5 years tenure. The dispatch log shows he clocked out at the Voss facility at 8:50 that evening. He paused. But the van's telemetry shows it leaving the facility at 9:14, 24 minutes after his official clockout. Rachel wrote that down. So Howell either clocked out and then got back in the van, or someone else was driving, or Garrett said carefully, he was told to clock out at 8:50 for reasons that had nothing to do with when he actually finished working. Rachel looked at the screen for a moment. "Then, pull everything you have on Howell. Employment records, address, any prior contact with the department, and cross-reference his scheduled routes against the clinic's inventory alteration dates going back 3 years." Garrett was already typing. "This is going to take a couple hours." "I know. Start with the most recent 18 months. She picked up her notebooks. "And Garrett, when you find the pattern, because there is a pattern, document it in the format that will survive a federal evidentiary review. This is not going to stay a county case." She'd said that last part in the flat, certain tone of someone who has already done the math and arrived at a number larger than the room they're standing in. The county attorney, whose name was Philip Marsh, and who had spent 20 carefully managing the line between professional integrity and political convenience, arrived at the sheriff's department at 10 o'clock, with the energy of a man who had decided, sometime in the previous hour, That being on the right side of this morning was more important than being on the comfortable side of it. He found Kincaid in his office and closed the door behind him. I need a full briefing, Marsh said. Everything you have, right now. Kincaid laid it out for him without editorializing. The data recorder, the photographs on Mason's phone, the Voss regional dispatch records, Dr. Brooks' 14 months of emails, Rachel's inventory analysis showing systematic alteration going back 3 years, Jody Farrell's recovery of the recorder from a deliberately set fire, Grant Voss, currently in state police custody on a service road outside county jurisdiction, having been located by a tip from a civilian who had been a cooperative witness rather than a suspect for the entire preceding 18 hours. Marsh sat down when Kincaid finished, which was notable because Marsh was not a man who sat down during briefings. He stood and listened and processed on his feet. Sitting down meant something had landed with enough weight to require support. The man we charged, Marsh said. Mason Callahan, currently released on humanitarian grounds, Kincaid said. At his home. His daughter had a medical episode this morning. The charges need to be formally withdrawn. Marsh looked at Kincaid steadily. Today, not a deferral, not a pending review status. Withdrawn. Full exoneration language. I know. And the withdrawal needs to be public. Marsh leaned forward slightly. Owen, I want you to understand what I'm saying. Not a press release. Not a statement through the communications office. Public. In person. Because the air was public and the man's reputation in this town took a public hit. And the only thing that repairs that is accountability that's visible at the same scale as the damage. Kincaid looked at him for a long moment. I know that too, he said. Marsh nodded once slowly. When this afternoon? Courthouse steps. I'll notify the riders still in the parking lot and give them the option to be present. He paused. They've earned that. Marsh picked up his briefcase. At the door, he stopped. The federal exposure on this, the supply diversion, the fraud, the intimidation, it's going to be significant. I'm going to need Rachel Monroe's notebooks, her full evidence log, and every chain of custody record from the moment the Farrell recovery was logged this morning. She'll have it ready. Owen. Marsh turned. His voice had changed, slightly less formal, more direct. Your deputy did exceptional work, under circumstances that were not easy. Kincaid nodded. I know that too, he said, for the third time. And each time he said it, it meant something slightly different. Rachel was at her desk when Kincaid appeared in her doorway. She was on the phone state investigator's office, the fourth call of the morning, and she held up one finger and finished the conversation in clipped, precise sentences that contained more information per word than most people manage per paragraph. When she hung up, she looked at Kincaid and waited. County attorney wants formal withdrawal documents on Callahan's charges. Full exoneration language. This afternoon. Rachel exhaled. Just once, quietly, the way you exhale, when you've been holding something for a long time and permission has been given to set it down. Yes, sir. Public statement. Courthouse steps. I want you present. I'll be there. Kincaid came fully into the office and sat down in the chair across from her desk, which in 4 years he had never done. He sat in it like a man who was no longer performing the version of himself that required standing. I owe you an apology, he said. I told you to stop questioning the warrant yesterday morning. You didn't stop, and I want you to know that I understand why you didn't, and I am telling you directly that you made the right call. Rachel looked at him. You changed direction when I brought you the evidence. That matters. It matters less than the fact that you had to fight to bring it. Sir, let me finish. His voice was not loud, but it had the quality of something that had been considered carefully before being spoken. I've been doing this job for 19 years. I've built a set of instincts that I trusted because they were right often enough to feel reliable. I stopped distinguishing between instincts that were based on evidence and instincts that were based on, he stopped, on things that had nothing to do with evidence. He looked at her steadily. That distinction is the job. I lost it somewhere. You didn't. The room was quiet for a moment. Mason Callahan carried my wife out of a wildfire, Kincaid said. I didn't know it when I put the handcuffs on him. But even if I had known, I'm not certain, sitting here right now, that I would have seen what I was doing differently. And that is the part that I have to carry. Rachel didn't respond immediately. She let the statement sit where he'd placed it, because it deserved that. What you do with it from here is what matters, she said finally. That's what he said at the diner. The first morning, Kincaid looked at her. What did he say? An apology matters only if the next man in his position receives fairness before the handcuffs. She met his eyes. He said it to me. Not to you. I think he meant it for you. Kincaid was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked to the door. Have the exoneration documents on my desk in 2 hours, he said. His voice was back to its operational register, but something underneath it was different that Rachel thought might be permanent. And Monroe, when this case is closed and the federal handoff is complete, I'm recommending you for lead investigator. He left before she could answer. She sat for a moment with her pen in her hand. Then she opened her notebook and started writing the documentation that was going to give Mason Callahan his life back. The call to Mason came at 11:15. Rachel made it herself because it was her call to make. She kept it short. The charges are being formally withdrawn this afternoon, she said. Full exoneration. Public statement, courthouse steps, 2 o'clock. I'd like you to be there if Lena's condition allows it. Mason was quiet for a moment on the other end. She could hear faintly the sound of the house around him, a television at low volume somewhere. The particular quality of indoor quiet that meant another person was nearby and resting. How is she? Rachel asked. Stable. She slept for 2 hours. He paused. Her color's better. Good. Rachel hesitated then. The data recorder from the van. It placed the vehicle at the exact location shown in your photographs at the exact timestamp of your camera gap. There's no gap anymore. There's just evidence of what you were doing. Another pause. Longer. When Mason spoke again, his voice was very quiet, and it was the first time in 36 hours that Rachel heard something in it that was not managed, but just present and real. Who was in the van? A man named Curtis Howell. Voss's driver. We're locating him now. He's not a suspect at this point. We think he may have been used without full knowledge of what he was transporting. She paused. Mason, what you saw when you stopped the open rear compartment, the empty containers, you didn't drive past that. I don't drive past things, he said, simply, as if it were the most obvious fact about himself. I know, Rachel said. That's why you're going home. She hung up and gathered her files and went to draft the most important document she'd written in 4 years on the force. 2 o'clock came with a heat that was already building toward the kind of afternoon that made the asphalt soft under boot heels. The courthouse steps were in full sun, and by the time Kincaid took his position at the top of the steps with Marsh beside him and Rachel 3 feet to his left, there were well over 100 people gathered, residents of Red Mesa. Most of them, people who had been talking about Mason Callahan for 36 hours and who now stood in the heat to hear what the law was going to say about what it had done. The 70 Hells Angels riders were there. They stood at the edge of the gathering, not in formation, not as a block distributed among the crowd the way anyone stands in a crowd. They had not been asked to leave the parking lot. They had been invited to be present, and they were present with the same quiet disciplines that had characterized every hour of their time in Red Mesa. Patsy Gorman was there. Harold Birch was there. The pastor of First Methodist was there. Mrs. Yardley was there, standing near the back with her hands folded in front of her and an expression that contained both vindication and something that looked very much like guilt, because Mrs. Yardley was the kind of woman who allowed herself to feel the weight of her own prior assumptions. Mason arrived with Lena on his arm. She was still moving carefully, but her color was what it should be, and her eyes were clear, and she held her father's arm with the grip of someone who is both giving and receiving support. They stood to the side of the steps, not on them, not elevated at the level of the crowd. Kincaid looked at the gathered town, and he did not consult notes. He had not written anything down. He had decided that this was not the kind of thing you read from a page. Yesterday morning at 5:12 a.m., I arrived at Mason Callahan's property with a search warrant based on an anonymous tip and a security camera image, he said. His voice was even and carried without effort in the open air. We found evidence on the property that appeared to confirm guilt. I authorized arrest and processing, and I did so with a conviction that I now have to stand here and tell you was not earned by the evidence, it was brought to the evidence. I had already decided what I was looking at, and I used the evidence to confirm a decision I'd made before I got out of my vehicle. The crowd was completely silent. That is not how this job is supposed to work, Kincaid said. And I am standing here today not because the law requires this statement, but because the man I arrested deserves to have it said in the same place and in front of the same community where his reputation was damaged. He turned his head slightly and looked directly at Mason. Mr. Callahan, the charges against you are fully withdrawn. You have been cleared of any involvement in the clinic robbery or any related criminal activity. The evidence developed over the past 24 hours establishes not only your innocence but your active assistance in bringing the actual perpetrator to justice. He paused. I am sorry for what you endured and for what your daughter endured. And I am sorry for what this town assumed before it took the time to ask. Mason stood very still with Lena's hand on his arm and the weathered Hell's Angels patch on his back and the full Arizona sun on his face. He did not smile. He did not perform relief. He looked at Kincaid with the direct and level gaze of a man who is receiving something that he always believed he was owed, and receiving it with neither triumph nor bitterness, because both would have required him to be smaller than he was. An apology matters only if the next man in my position receives fairness before the handcuffs, Mason said. Kincaid held his gaze. Understood. And then Mason did something no one in the crowd had expected. He walked up the 3 steps to where Kincaid was standing and put out his hand. Kincaid looked at it for 1 second, a second that was visible to everyone present, a second in which a man looked at an outstretched hand and decided who he was going to be, and then he shook it, firmly, without looking away. The crowd responded. Not with cheering, it was too charged for cheering, but with a sound that was collective and human and not entirely dry-eyed in several places. Patsy Gorman pressed her lips together. Harold Birch looked at the ground for a moment and then looked back up, and something in his face suggested he was doing a quiet accounting of things he'd said over coffee that morning. Lena Callahan watched her father shake the hand of the man who had put him in handcuffs, and she breathed out slowly, and the breath that came in after it felt, for the first time in 36 hours, like it had full room to enter. The federal picture began assembling itself with a speed that the county level had not anticipated. The state investigators who had mobilized at Rachel's request the previous day arrived at the sheriff's department by late afternoon with a jurisdictional transfer order and a team of 4 that moved with the specific efficiency of people who had been waiting for a case like this to become accessible. Rachel handed over her notebooks, all 3 of them, along with every chain of custody record, every photograph document, every email from Dr. Brooks, and the complete evidence file for the data recorder, with a detailed memo that traced the evidentiary chain from the clinic robbery backward through 3 years of supply diversion. The lead federal investigator, a woman named Special Agent Diana Cruz, read the memo in 12 minutes and looked up at Rachel. You built this in 30 hours. 28, Rachel said, and I had help from the writers. Cruz looked at her. The Hell's Angels chapter. They provided documentation of their own movements that broke the alibi gap and provided the photographic evidence that located the van. They also physically located Voss when he attempted to leave the county and reported his position to us. Rachel paused. They did not attempt to confront or detain him. Cruz wrote something down. Their cooperation is going to be material to the federal prosecution. She looked at Rachel. You understand that this goes well beyond Grant Voss. Supply diversion at this scale through county contractor channels with documented pressure on a clinical director and falsified inventory records going back 3 years. There are other actors in this system. People who received the diverted medication. People who processed the payments. The county official whose office communicated the pressure to Dr. Brooks. I know, Rachel said. This is going to get larger before it gets smaller. I know that too. Cruz closed her folder. Stay available. We're going to need your testimony, Doctor. Naomi Brooks arrived at the sheriff's department at 4 in the afternoon with her attorney and the full 14 months of documentation she had been carrying alone. She was 53 years old and she had the bearing of a woman who had been told repeatedly that her instincts were inconvenient and had chosen to trust them anyway. She sat across from Rachel and Agent Cruz, and she laid out the record with a precision that came from having rehearsed it in her own mind hundreds of times. The first discrepancy I noticed was in the cardiac medication inventory, she said. Batch 7741C. The delivery manifest showed an 18-month shelf life. The inventory system, 72 hours after delivery, showed 9 months remaining. I raised it with my department head. I was told the system had been updated to reflect anticipated usage rates. She paused. That is not how inventory systems work. You do not adjust a manufacturer's shelf life based on anticipated usage. I wrote it down and kept the original manifest. How many batches over the 14 months? Cruz asked. 31, Dr. Brooks said, without hesitation, because she had counted them many times. 31 separate batch discrepancies, totaling, at manufacturer's retail value, approximately $900,000 in medication reported as expiring or disposed when the manufacturer's records show it was viable. Cruz was writing, 900,000. That's the retail value. The secondary market value for this category of medication through private distribution channels is considerably higher. Rachel thought about the 3 donor plaques in the clinic's waiting room, about the budget meetings, about the ease with which a man's reputation, built correctly and maintained carefully in the right rooms, becomes the kind of authority that makes people doubt their own correct instincts. Dr. Brooks, Rachel said, the message you received 3 weeks ago, the one about your contract renewal. I need the full context. Brooks looked at her attorney, who nodded once. It came through my department head, Alan Reyes. He told me that he had received a communication from the county administrator's office indicating that a review of my contract renewal, which is discretionary in the first year, might be complicated by what was characterized as my pattern of raising operational disputes. She paused. My operational disputes were the 31 inventory discrepancies. Reyes passed this message to you directly. Yes, in person, in my office. In the county administrator's office, did Reyes name a specific individual? He said it had come through the administrator's liaison for contractor relations. She paused. That position is held by a man named Dale Firth. Dale Firth and Grant Voss have been co-members of the County Civic Development Board for 4 years. Cruz and Rachel exchanged a look that contained, in compressed form, the entire shape of how power protects itself, not through dramatic conspiracy, but through the quiet adjacency of people who eat at the same tables and serve on the same boards and understand without saying it that their interests are aligned. We'll need your full statement on Reyes and Firth, Cruz said. Everything you have. Everything I have is already on this drive, Doctor, Brooks said. She set it on the table between them. I have been waiting 14 months to give it to someone who would do something with it. Rachel received it into evidence and logged it with a care that was also, in its way, a kind of acknowledgement of what it cost to hold something that long, waiting for the moment when the right person was listening. By 7 in the evening, the Hells Angels riders had mostly left Red Mesa. They went in the same organized, undramatic way they had arrived, helmets on, single file, legal speed, no formation theater. As they rode out along the main road, something happened that nobody had planned and nobody would fully account for afterward. People came out, not to watch, not to take photographs. They came out, and some of them raised a hand, and some of them just stood at the edge of the road. And a few of them, Mrs. Yardley was one, and Patsy Gorman was another. In a moment that cost her something she would feel, for a long time held handwritten signs, not prepared signs, paper bags torn open and written on with whatever marker was nearest. One said thank you. One said we were wrong. One, held by a man Rachel didn't recognize, said simply mercy run. The riders didn't stop, but they saw, and several of them raised a hand in return. Wade Calloway was the last to leave. He pulled up in front of Mason's garage and killed the engine and sat for a moment. Mason came out onto the porch, and Lena appeared in the doorway behind him. "She's really okay?" Wade asked, looking at Lena. "She's really okay," Mason said. Wade nodded slowly. He looked at the garage, at the building that had been searched before sunrise 36 hours ago. That had held evidence that wasn't Mason's for exactly as long as it needed to make a man look guilty to people who were ready to believe he was. "I've got your bike at the chapter house. I'll bring it back this weekend. No rush." Wade looked at him. "You know what the hardest part of today was for me?" "What?" "Watching you shake his hand." He said it simply, without judgment, but with the weight of someone who was not certain he could have done the same. "Kincaid, after everything." Mason leaned against the porch railing and looked at the sky, which was moving into the deep blue of an Arizona evening. "He made a bad call and then he corrected it," he said. "That's more than most people manage." He paused. "My father made bad calls and never corrected them. There's a difference." Wade was quiet for a moment. "You're a better man than I am. You drove through the night and organized 71 people on 4 hours' notice," Mason said. "Don't sell yourself short." Wade almost smiled. He started the engine. "I'll see you at the Mercy Run." "You'll see me at the Mercy Run." Wade rode out, and Mason watched the taillights until they were gone, and then he stood on his porch in the cooling evening air and breathed. Inside the house, Lena was at the kitchen table with the blue notebook, not her father's medical schedule, but her own notebook, the one she'd been keeping for 2 years since the cardiac diagnosis, the one where she wrote down everything she was learning in the paramedic training she'd enrolled in 6 months ago, quietly, without telling anyone but Mrs. Yardley, because she had looked at her father and understood something that most people took much longer to understand, that the way to honor someone who has spent 30 years protecting others is to become capable of protection yourself. She heard the door and looked up. Mason came in and sat across from her at the table and looked at the notebook and then at her. "What's that?" he asked. She told him. He sat very still while she explained. The paramedic program. The 18 months of coursework. The clinical hours she'd been completing at the county hospital on the days she'd told him she was doing extended shifts at the library. The certification exam she was scheduled to take in 6 weeks. He didn't speak for a long time. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked. Lena looked at him directly. "Because you would have worried about my heart, and your worrying would have made me worry, and I couldn't afford to worry. I needed to do it." She paused. "Also because I wanted to show you, not tell you." Mason looked at his daughter, at her face, which had his composure and her mother's eyes, and something that was entirely her own, and he felt something move through him that was too large and too quiet for a name. It was not pride, though pride was in it. It was not relief, though that was in it too. It was the specific sensation of watching someone become who they were always going to become, and understanding that the most important thing you did was simply stay present and let them. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, she confirmed. He nodded. "I'll be there when you take the exam." "I know you will," she said. And then, very quietly, "Dad, I was never scared of the handcuffs." He looked at her. "I was scared that this town wasn't brave enough to look past them," she said. "And then it turned out they just needed someone to show them where to look." She paused. "Rachel did that. And Wade. And you." She closed the notebook. "You showed them first. You've been showing them for 30 years. Mason Callahan sat at his kitchen table in the house on the western edge of Red Mesa while the Arizona night came fully in, and he did not say anything for a long time, because some things arrive with a weight that language reduces. He just sat with his daughter in the kitchen light and felt the truth of what she'd said settle into him, not as triumph, not as vindication, but as something simpler and more durable than either. Outside, the desert was doing what it always did. existing on its own terms, vast and patient and indifferent to the stories told about it by the people who passed through. But inside that kitchen, in the specific and ordinary warmth of a father and daughter at a table, something had been repaired that had nothing to do with charges withdrawn or evidence logged or statements made on courthouse steps. It had to do with being seen, finally, fully, by the town that had driven past the sign on the garage for 30 years without stopping. And in the evidence room at the Red Mesa Sheriff's Department, in a carefully logged chain of custody bag, a data recorder sat containing 3 years of truth that was about to dismantle the lives of the people who had built their safety on the certainty that a town would believe a patch before it believed a man. They had been right about the town. They had been wrong about the man. And the distance between those two things, the space between what a community assumes and what a person actually is, was exactly where justice had finally found its footing. The federal indictment came down on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the morning Owen Kincaid had driven 4 patrol vehicles onto Mason Callahan's gravel in the dark. Grant Voss was charged with 17 counts medical supply fraud, evidence tampering, intimidation of a clinical witness, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and 9 additional counts related to the secondary distribution network that Special Agent Diana Cruz's team had spent 5 weeks unraveling with the patience and precision of people who understood that the visible part of a scheme is always the smallest part. Dale Firth, the county administrator's liaison, was charged with 4 counts, including conspiracy and abuse of public office. Alan Reyes, Dr. Brooks' department head, accepted a cooperation agreement and provided testimony that named 2 additional recipients in the county's contractor oversight structure whose involvement had been the quietest and therefore the most protected. Curtis Howell, the Voss regional driver, who had been unconscious in the van cab when Mason stopped on the side road, turned out to be exactly what Rachel had suspected from the beginning, a man who had known something was wrong with his routes for over a year, who had asked questions he was told to stop asking, and who had been rendered unconscious that night, not by accident, but by a sedative someone had put in the coffee he'd been given before his shift. He had woken up in a hospital with no memory of the service road and a company attorney already in his room, explaining that he'd had a medical episode and that Voss Regional was covering all his expenses. When Cruz's team interviewed Howell, he cried. Not from relief, though relief was part of it, but from the specific release of a man who has been carrying the weight of suspecting himself for something he didn't do and has finally been given permission to set it down. Rachel sat in on that interview, and she thought about Mason in the holding cell and about the particular cruelty of being made to doubt your own innocence. Howell's testimony filled in the last section of the evidentiary picture that the data recorder and Dr. Brooks's emails had left partially open. He had seen the clinic containers in the van on multiple occasions. He had asked his dispatcher what they were transporting on the unmarked side road routes. He had been told it was medical waste disposal, and he had almost believed it, except that medical waste containers were sealed and marked, and the ones in his van were sometimes not sealed and sometimes were. When the road was rough, he could hear them shift with the specific weight of something that had not been fully emptied. He had written it in his personal log. Not an official log, his personal one, the kind a careful man keeps, because he is not yet sure what he is dealing with, but he knows the day might come when he wishes he had written it down. The log was at his apartment, in a drawer he hadn't thought about in 6 weeks because he'd been in the hospital, and then in protective housing while Cruz's team worked. When Cruz's investigators retrieved it, Rachel called Jody Farrell because Jody had been the one to pull the data recorder from the burning building, and she deserved to know that the chain she'd held together under smoke was now complete. Jody picked up on the first ring. "Tell me," she said. "Howell's log," Rachel said. It documents 17 separate unmarked route runs over 14 months. Dates, times, van ID, observations about the cargo. It corroborates everything, the inventory records, the batch numbers, the alteration timeline. The last entry is dated 11 days before the robbery. She paused. 11 days before that is when Voss brought his van into Mason's garage for service. Jody was quiet for a moment. He was in Mason's garage with a van that had already been used for 17 diversion runs. He knew the layout, Rachel said. He knew the camera. He knew the lock. He'd been planning the frame for months. He just needed the right moment, a shipment large enough to justify a dramatic loss event, and a scapegoat whose reputation would do the work before the evidence was examined. And Mason was the person who was most visible and most prejudged, Rachel said. Voss didn't choose him out of malice. He chose him out of calculation. He knew exactly how this town thought. Jody made a sound that was not quite a word. Then, is Mason okay? Rachel thought about the courthouse steps, about the handshake, about Lena at the kitchen table with her paramedic notebook. He's more than okay, she said. Come to the Mercy Run next month. You'll see. The civil restitution process moved faster than anyone expected, partly because Voss's assets were substantial, and partly because the federal prosecutors had structured the forfeiture provisions with the specific intent of returning resources to the communities that had been most directly harmed by the diversion scheme. The rural clinics that had been operating with systematically depleted medication inventories for 3 years received the first tranche of restitution funds within 10 weeks of the indictment. The Red Mesa Community Clinic received enough to fully restock its emergency medication inventory and fund 18 months of expanded operating hours. Dr. Naomi Brooks oversaw every line item of the restitution allocation herself. She had been offered a leave of absence by the County Health Board, a politely worded suggestion that she might want distance from the institution while the investigation completed, and she had declined it with a politeness that contained exactly no room for negotiation. She had raised the alarm 14 months ago. She had documented the discrepancy 31 times. She had held the emails when there was no one to give them to and given them the moment there was. The institution could offer her distance from the outside, but she would not create it from the inside. I'm staying, she told the board, not because I need to prove something, because these patients need someone who knows where every batch number has been for the past 3 years. And right now that person is me. The board accepted her refusal without argument, which told her something about how much the landscape had shifted in 10 weeks. When the powerful become exposed, the structures around them recalibrate with a speed that makes you understand how much of their authority had always been borrowed from the assumption that they would never be held accountable. Rachel Monroe was officially appointed lead investigator for the Red Mesa Sheriff's Department on a Thursday morning in a brief departmental ceremony that Kincaid kept short because he knew Rachel preferred it that way. He handed her the transfer paperwork and shook her hand and said, "Don't stop writing things down." She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, which he registered as an indictment of the preceding 4 years that he accepted without defense. "I never stopped," she said. "I know. I'm asking you to keep going," she had already started. The case she was now building with Cruz's federal team as the primary driver and Rachel as the county-level liaison had expanded beyond Voss and Firth and Reyes into the secondary distribution network, which turned out to involve 3 private medical distribution companies in 2 states. The investigation had a projected timeline of 18 months. Rachel had opened a 4th notebook. She had also, quietly and without telling anyone except Kincaid, submitted a formal proposal to the county for new evidence handling protocols on anonymous tip warrants. The proposal required corroborating evidence from a source independent of the tip before any property search could be authorized. A minimum 4-hour review window between tip receipt and warrant execution, and mandatory documentation of any investigating officer's prior relationship, personal or professional, with the subject of the warrant. The proposal was accepted with one modification. The review window was extended to 8 hours and was signed into county policy on the same day the Voss federal indictment was formally filed. Nobody issued a press release about it. Rachel did not expect one. The point of a policy was not the announcement. The point was the next person who stood on a porch at 5:12 in the morning and had not yet been asked the right questions. Kincaid signed the policy himself, and he kept the signed copy on his desk rather than in the filing cabinet, in the specific spot where the two photographs had been the wildfire image and the close-up of the burn mark on Mason's vest. He had returned the photographs to Rachel, who had returned the vest to Mason. But he remembered what the photographs looked like. He intended to keep remembering. The Mercy run that year was different from every prior run in the 16-year history of the Desert Mercy program. It was different not because the route changed, it didn't, or because the mission changed, it didn't, but because of what was waiting along the route when the riders came through. Mason had not announced anything. Wade had not organized a reception. The chapter had sent its standard pre-run notifications to the rural communities on the delivery schedule, the same form letter they'd been sending every year, listing approximate arrival times and the supplies being brought. Nothing in the letter was different from any prior year. But Red Mesa knew now, and knowledge, when it attaches to something that has been misread for a long time, has a way of expressing itself. The morning of the run began the way it always began, riders gathering at the chapter house before dawn. Vehicles loaded the night before, every box logged and labeled and assigned, the route checked twice for road conditions, and the communities confirmed for expected needs. Wade ran the logistics briefing with his customary precision, and Mace listened at the back of the room the way a road captain listens, not as the authority in the space, but as the person whose job it is to know every detail well enough that he can respond to the moment when the plan meets reality and they don't quite align. Lena was there. She was in paramedic gear. Her certification had come through 4 days earlier. The exam passed on the first attempt with a score that her instructor described in the written feedback as remarkable, given her documented cardiac history, which Lena read as the most meaningful compliment she had ever received. She stood beside a county ambulance that had been donated through the Federal Restitution Fund and assigned to the Desert Mercy program specifically for medical emergency response on rural routes. It was white and clean and bore the Desert Mercy logo on its side panel, a design that Wade had pulled from the chapter's archive, the same one that had been on their documentation materials for 16 years. Mason looked at her standing beside that ambulance in the pre-dawn dark and felt the specific silence of a man who has run out of words, not because there are none, but because the ones available are insufficient to the moment. She saw him looking. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't get that face. You'll make me lose my composure before the run even starts, and I refuse to cry in paramedic gear." He pressed his lips together. "You passed on the first attempt." "I know. With a cardiac history." "Dad, I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. I'm saying stop saying it, or I'm going to cry, and I look terrible when I cry, and these are new boots." He stopped saying it, but he didn't stop feeling it, and she knew he didn't, and the knowing was enough. When the riders moved out, Lena drove the ambulance behind them, and it was the cleanest integration of new and old that any of them had experienced. The motorcycles and the medical vehicle moving together through the early morning dark, the route the same as it had been for 16 years. The mission unchanged, but the capacity expanded in the specific way that things expand when the people around you finally understand what you've been doing all along. The first community on the route was a cluster of homes 30 miles outside Red Mesa, a place called Dry Fork that had a population of about 80 people, mostly elderly, mostly fixed income, with one small clinic that operated 2 days a week with a traveling physician. The Mercy Run had been bringing them water, medical supplies, and generator fuel for 12 years. Every year, the chapter's arrival was received with the quiet gratitude of people who have learned not to expect very much and are consistently surprised that it keeps showing up. This year was different. When the riders came over the rise toward Dry Fork, there were people standing along the road. Not a crowd. Dry Fork didn't have the population for a crowd, but every person in the community who was ambulatory was outside. Some of them held things, water bottles, boxes of supplies they'd collected to donate toward the next run, handwritten cards. An elderly man named Walter Sheets, who was 91 years old and had lived in Dry Fork his entire life and received Mercy Run supplies for 12 of them, was standing at the road's edge in his good shirt with a piece of cardboard that said Ed thank yous he had painted himself. Mason pulled over. He always pulled over at Dry Fork. It was the first stop on the route, and the delivery here required more time because Walter Sheets insisted on signing for everything individually and asking the name of every person who carried a box. Walter looked at Mason when he climbed off the bike. He looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, "Without preamble, I heard what they did to you." Mason started to say something. Walter shook his head. "Let me finish. I heard what they did, and I heard what you did after. And I want to tell you something that I've been meaning to tell you for 12 years. He paused. He was a man who had learned patience through proximity to the end of things, and he used it now. The first year you came to Dry Fork, my wife was alive. She had a cardiac condition, and the medication she needed was only available through the clinic in town. And the summer that year was the worst I'd seen in 40 years, and the road was the road was bad. And I didn't know how I was going to get her medication to her." He stopped. "You brought it. I didn't ask you. I didn't know you. But you had it on the truck, and you carried it to the door, and you wouldn't take anything for it, and you didn't ask for thanks. You just said, and I remember this exactly, you said, 'We pass this way every year. You let us know what you need.'" Mason was very still. "My wife lived another 3 years, Walter said. Good years. Years where she knew what she needed was going to come. Not because the system sent it, because you came." He looked at the Hells Angels patch, looked at it directly, without flinching, without the sideways discomfort that Mason had watched people perform in the vicinity of that patch for 30 years. "I don't know what that means to anyone else. I know what it means to me." He put out his hand. Mason shook it, and then he did something that surprised everyone present, including himself. He put his other hand over Walter's and held it for a moment. "The way you hold a hand when a handshake isn't quite enough for what the moment contains." "We'll keep coming," Mason said. "I know you will," Walter said. "That's the whole point." The route continued. Community by community, the run moved through the desert with the same efficiency it always had. The supplies distributed and logged and signed for. The medical cases transferred and the generator fuel delivered, and the water cases stacked carefully where they'd be accessible through the heat that was already building in the morning air. At every stop, something was different. Not dramatic, not speeches or ceremonies. Nothing that would have felt performative or uncomfortable to the chapter's way of doing things. Just people who had heard the story and had decided, in the way that ordinary people decide things without announcement, that knowing the truth required a response. A woman at the second stop handed Wade a box of donated medical supplies with a note attached that said, "We should have done this sooner." He took it without comment and added it to the inventory log, and only later, sitting on his bike while the others finished the delivery, allowed himself to feel the full weight of those 5 words. "We should have done this sooner." He thought about how many years the riders had come through these communities carrying what was needed, and how many years the communities had received it without fully understanding what it was they were receiving, not just the supplies, but the testimony of people who showed up when the systems that were supposed to show up didn't. He thought about how much easier the past 36 hours could have been if Red Mesa had known, before the arrest, what Walter Sheets had known for 12 years. He decided that the most useful response to that thought was not anger but action, and he opened his route notebook and wrote, next to the entry for Walter Sheets' stop, Annual Dry Fork Update Full Community Briefing on Program History and Next Year's Needs. Then he turned the page and started a new section headed, Communication. The Mercy Run was going to become more visible, not louder, more visible. There was a difference, and Wade understood it precisely. Midway through the route, at a stop called Red Gulch, Mason's phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw Rachel Monroe's name. He stepped away from the activity and answered. Cruz's team made the second round of arrests this morning, Rachel said, without preamble. 2 distributors in Phoenix, 1 in Tucson. The full secondary network. They're calling it the largest medical supply fraud prosecution in Arizona in 11 years. Mason was quiet for a moment. How many people? 14 arrests total, including Voss's original 3. The rural clinic shortage that the diversion caused Cruz's team quantified it. 23 rural communities. 3-year shortage on cardiac medication, insulin analogs, and emergency coagulants. They're still determining whether anyone's health was directly impacted, but the exposure period was long enough that she stopped. It was long enough. Mason thought about Walter Sheets's wife, about the cardiac medication that had come on the run every year, about the possibility that somewhere in those 23 communities, there was a person whose access to what they needed had been quietly, systematically compromised by a man who had calculated that nobody would check the inventory of people who were far enough from town not to be noticed. The recovered funds, he said. The restitution allocation is being expanded. Cruz is recommending that the Rural Community Medical Access Fund receive a priority disbursement. A pause. I told her about the Mercy Run, about the 16 years, about what the chapter has been delivering to the communities that were shorted. Another pause. She wants to recommend the program for a federal Community Health Partnership designation. It would make the run eligible for supply matching from federal emergency health reserves. Double the capacity of every run. Mason stood at the edge of Red Gulch in the building desert heat and processed what Rachel had just said. Not the legal aspect, he followed that clearly enough. The other thing, that the program his chapter had built over 16 years out of their own pockets and their own time and their own understanding that certain people needed help that wasn't coming from anywhere official. That program was now going to be recognized, partnered, expanded. Not because anyone had applied for recognition, because the truth of what it was had finally been seen by people with the authority to respond to it. Tell Cruz yes, Mason said. I thought you'd want to think about it. I don't need to think about it. It involves federal oversight and reporting requirements. Quarterly documentation. Wade was born to fill out quarterly documentation, Mason said. Tell Cruz yes. He could hear Rachel almost smile. Already sent the response, she said. I was just calling to tell you. He stood there for a moment after she hung up, with the desert around him and the sounds of the run behind him, riders and supplies and his daughter's ambulance, and the organized movement of people who had decided a long time ago that the right response to a gap in the world was to fill it with whatever you had. He thought about what it meant. Not the partnership, the thing beneath the partnership. The thing that had made the partnership possible. The 36 hours in which a town had confronted the space between what it had assumed and what was true, and had chosen not uniformly, not without resistance, not without the specific discomfort of people who are discovering that their certainty was a kind of laziness to let the truth reorganize what they thought they knew. That was the harder thing. Not the federal designation, not the indictments. The harder thing was Patsy Gorman standing on the side of the road with a paper bag that said we were wrong, and knowing that writing those words had cost her something, and that the cost was exactly what made them mean something. The run finished at 4:30 in the afternoon, and the last community on the route was a place called Morrow Flats, where 12 families lived in structures that the county had been intending to connect to reliable utilities for 6 years without completing the project. The Mercy Run had been bringing them generator fuel specifically for refrigeration to keep medication cold through summer temperatures that reached levels where most medication degraded within hours without proper storage. When the riders arrived at Morrow Flats, Mason found something he had not found in 12 years of stopping there. A generator. Installed. County issued with a utility connection line that was clean and new and had clearly been placed within the past several weeks. He stood and looked at it, and then he looked at the woman who came out of the nearest house. Her name was Elena Morales. She had 2 children and a diabetic husband whose insulin had been a consistent concern every summer, and he said, "When did that go in?" Elena looked at the generator with the expression of someone who still hasn't quite trusted a good thing to stay. 3 weeks ago, county utility showed up, no warning, put it in 1 day, and left. No bill. I called to ask about the bill, and they said it was covered under an emergency rural access allocation. She looked at Mason. I don't know what that means. Mason thought about Rachel's voice on the phone, about Cruz's team, about what restitution funds become when they're directed toward the people who were actually shorted. It means someone finally did the math, he said. Elena looked at him, at the patch on his back, at the riders behind him, and the ambulance at the end of the line with his daughter visible through the windshield. People in town are saying what happened, she said carefully, what they did to you, and what you did after. Mason began unloading the supply cases. People in town say a lot of things. They're saying the right things now, Elena said. She moved to help him with the cases. My husband heard. He wanted me to tell you if you ever need anything. Any work done on those bikes. Anything at all. Mason carried the case to the storage area she indicated, and on the way back, he stopped and looked at her directly. Tell your husband we'll be back next year. Same time. If he needs anything before then, the number's on the delivery sheet. It was the same thing he said every year. The same offer he made at every stop. But this year, Elena without the quality in her expression that was different from prior years, not more grateful. Exactly, but more certain. The certainty of a person who has seen what an offer looks like when it's backed by something real and now knows how to recognize it. The riders reassembled for the return at 5 o'clock. The run was complete, every delivery made, every signature collected, every community checked off Wade's meticulously maintained log. The ambulance had been used once, for a non-emergency at the third stop. An elderly man who had been experiencing chest discomfort that turned out to be dehydration and was resolved with fluids and monitoring over 40 minutes. Lena had handled it with the specific calm of someone who is trained for a moment and, when it arrives, discovers that training has made it smaller than the fear of it. Mason watched her complete her post-response documentation in the ambulance before they left Morrow Flats. She wrote quickly and precisely the same handwriting that had been in the blue notebook on the kitchen counter the morning the patrol vehicles came. He thought about that morning, about the notebook, about Lena's face in the doorway, about the medication schedule he'd tried to give 60 seconds to relay, and the 60 seconds that had been refused. He thought about how different the calculus of that morning would have been if the town had known then what it knew now. If Kincaid's instinct had been calibrated by knowledge rather than assumption. If the anonymous tip had been received by a protocol that required a second look before the handcuffs. He thought about Rachel's policy. The 8-hour review window. The corroborating evidence requirement. The mandatory documentation of officer relationships. All of it now signed and in the county records. All of it now the law of the land he lived in and the mechanism that would protect not him. He was past the point of needing it for himself, but the next person who stood on a porch in the dark and said something that the people arriving had not yet learned to hear. That was the legacy, not the acquittal, not the indictment, not the federal partnership or the restitution funds or the generator in Morrow Flats, though all of those mattered and would continue to matter in the lives of real people. The legacy was the policy, the changed question, the moment before the handcuffs when someone would now be required by law to ask, is this the picture we carry, or is this the man standing inside it? Wade materialized beside him the way Wade always did without announcement, without requiring attention. Ready? He said. Yeah, Lena's good? She's more than good. Wade nodded, looking at the ambulance. She's got your patience, he said. That's a rare thing to inherit. She's got her own version of it, Mason said. Better than mine. Wade considered that. You going to tell her that? She already knows. That's not the same as hearing it. Mason was quiet for a moment. Then he walked to the ambulance and knocked on the passenger window. Lena looked up from her documentation. He made the motion for her to open the window, and she did. You handled that well today, he said. She waited. She had inherited his patience. You handled it better than I would have, he said. At your age, with everything going on, you handled it better. Lena looked at him for a moment. Now you're just trying to make me cry before we get back to the highway. I mean it. I know you mean it, she said. That's why I'm going to cry. She looked back at her documentation. Go get on your bike. He went and got on his bike. The column moved out the riders first. Mason at the front with the road captain's position that 16 years had settled into the natural fact of his relationship to this route and these people and this purpose, and Lena in the ambulance at the rear, and between them 70 miles of Arizona desert that held, in its impassive and enduring way, all the heat and history and silence that the day had moved through. As they came back over the rise toward Red Mesa, Mason could see the town in the late afternoon light, the water tower, the clinic, the courthouse steps where a statement had been made that could not be unmade, the streets where people had stood with paper bags and written things that cost them something to write. He could see, distantly, his garage on the western edge of town, the structure that had been searched and emptied, and then returned to him, cleaner in a certain sense than it had been. Before, cleaner of the specific grime that accumulates when a place is known by the worst story told about it rather than the truest one. He rode into town at the front of the column, and the town was different. Not transformed people did not transform in 36 hours, but adjusted, recalibrated towards something that was not, perhaps, very different from what it had always been capable of, but had never quite been asked to produce. People were out. Not the whole town, enough of the town, standing at the edge of things, watching, some of them raising a hand. The pastor of First Methodist, who had posted about remaining calm when the riders arrived, stood outside his church with his hands sides and nodded once, seriously, as Mason passed, the nod of a man who is acknowledging something he was late in understanding, but has decided not to be late in acknowledging. Patsy Gorman stood outside her feed store and did not cross to the other side of the street. It was a small thing. It was also everything. The column moved through and found its way to the chapter house for the post-run debrief and inventory reconciliation, and the ambulance pulled in alongside the bikes, and the riders climbed off and started the organized work of unloading the return equipment and completing the documentation that Wade required with the consistency of a man who has never confused the mission with the paperwork and understands that the paperwork is part of the mission. At some point during the unloading, Kincaid arrived. He came without a vehicle. He had walked from the department, which was 3 blocks away, and he came without his jacket, which meant he had made a decision to come before he had time to fully prepare for it. He stood at the edge of the chapter house lot and looked at the organized activity of the post-run breakdown, and Mason saw him before anyone else did. He handed his helmet to Wade and walked over. Kincaid looked at him. "I wanted to see it," he said. "The run? I was too late for the run I wanted to see." He stopped. He was not a man who struggled for words, and the struggling was visible in a way that made Mason understand. It was intentional that Kincaid was choosing not to smooth it over with professional language. "I wanted to see this, the way it works after, the way you come back and do the inventory and talk to each other." He looked at the riders, at Lena, who was completing her ambulance checklist with 2 other chapter members who had been helping her navigate the documentation requirements. "I wanted to understand what I was looking at, in the full version, not just the patch." Mason stood beside him, and they both looked at the organized, ordinary, purposeful activity of a group of people completing work they had decided was worth doing. "Now you've seen it," Mason said. "Yeah." Kincaid was quiet for a moment. "What's the hardest part?" Mason thought about it. "Finding the communities that don't know to ask," he said. "The ones that have stopped expecting anyone to show up. Getting through to them takes longer, because they've learned not to hope for it." Kincaid absorbed that. "And you keep going back, every year, even when, especially when." Kincaid was quiet again, and in the quiet, there was the weight of everything that had happened in the 36 hours between the patrol vehicles arriving in the dark and the 2 of them standing in a chapter house lot in the late afternoon. And Mason let the weight be what it was without trying to reduce it. "The policy Rachel wrote," Kincaid said. "The evidence review protocol. I want you to know it's already been used once." Mason looked at him. "Already? Anonymous tip came in 3 days ago. Property search request." The tip was unverified and the subject was, he paused. The subject fit a profile that would have moved quickly under the old process. He held Mason's gaze. Under the new protocol, we requested corroborating evidence within the 8-hour window. The corroborating evidence didn't exist. The tip turned out to be a neighbor dispute. He paused. Nobody was handcuffed. Mason was quiet for a moment. Good. It works, Kincaid said, and his voice contained the specific satisfaction of a man who has changed something structural and seen it function in the real world for the first time. The policy works. Policies work when the people enforcing them believe in them, Mason said. That's the part you can't write into the document. Kincaid looked at him. I believe in it. I know, Mason said. That's why I'm not worried about it. Lena appeared beside them, her checklist complete, her paramedic gear still on. She looked at Kincaid with the direct assessment of a young woman who has her father's eyes and her own history with what this man had done and what he'd done after. Kincaid looked at her. Miss Callahan, I understand congratulations are in order. I heard about the certification. Lena studied him for a moment. I heard you signed Rachel Monroe's promotion, she said, and the evidence protocol. I did, she nodded once. Slowly, with the measured acknowledgement of someone who is giving credit where it is due without giving more than is due. It was a precise social calibration that Kincaid recognized, because he had watched it on her father's face on courthouse steps 10 days earlier. The Callahans were, he was coming to understand, a family with very accurate scales. Thank you, she said. And then she went back to the ambulance to complete the final item on her checklist, because she was not quite finished, and she didn't leave things unfinished. Kincaid watched her go. She's going to be exceptional, he said. She already is, Mason said. I'm just trying to keep up. The evening came in the way Arizona evenings come in, fast and complete. The temperature dropping with a decision that the desert makes without consultation. The sky moving through its extraordinary color sequence as though reminding anyone who's watching that the world operates on its own schedule and has never required an audience. Mason was the last to leave the chapter house lot. Wade had gone an hour earlier after extracting a promise from Mason that he would eat a real dinner and sleep in his own bed, which were the two things Wade Calloway considered non-negotiable for human functioning. Lena had driven the ambulance back to the county facility where it was housed and had texted her father 3 words, home soon, tired, that were the best possible version of a status update. Mason stood alone in the lot with his bike, and the settled quiet of a day fully completed, and he thought about the question Kincaid had asked him that morning, weeks ago, on the courthouse steps. What did the patch mean? He hadn't answered it then with everything it deserved. He had answered it with the truest, short version. I never ride past someone who needs me, and that was accurate, but it was not complete. The complete version was longer and did not compress well into a sentence. The complete version was Walter Sheets in his good shirt with a painted cardboard sign. It was Elena Morales carrying cases to the storage area without being asked. It was Jody Farrell in a burning corridor with both arms around a data recorder. It was Dr. Brooks holding 14 months of emails through the long, specific loneliness of a person who knows the truth and cannot yet find someone willing to hear it. It was Lena in the ambulance doorway, new certification, new boots, learning to extend the protection her father had practiced for 30 years into a professional form that the world could finally, officially receive. It was Rachel Monroe's 4 notebooks. It was the policy with the 8-hour window. It was a man who woke up at 5:12 in the morning to 4 patrol vehicles and chose, in that first moment, to be exactly who he had always been. The patch meant all of that. It had always meant all of that. The town had simply not yet known how to read it. Mason Callahan put on his helmet, started his engine, and rode home through the last light of an Arizona evening with the weathered Hells Angels patch on his back visible, unapologetic, and finally fully seen for what it had always been, the mark of a man who showed up when others didn't, who stayed when others left, who helped without requiring credit and rode towards smoke while others waited for the all clear. The rest, as he had once told a sheriff on a courthouse landing, was just thread. But the man wearing it had always been the truth. And the truth, once it is known, cannot be made unknown, not by a false expiration date, Not by an anonymous tip, not by a 17-minute gap in a recording, not by the weight of 30 years of being misread by a town that never took the time to ask. Mason Callahan rode home to his daughter and his garage in his life, and Red Mesa was, for the first time in 30 years, exactly the place it had always had the capacity to be, a town that knew what it owed and had finally begun the long work of paying it.